It was late in World War II, on a small island in the Philippines called Lubang. One morning, a Japanese soldier named Lieutenant Hiru Onoda moved silently out of the dense jungle. He crouched low at the edge of a massive rice field, his eyes scanning the area. A moment later, another soldier, a man named Kozuka, emerged from the trees behind him. Together, they began to crawl on their bellies through the mud, inching their way toward huge bundles of freshly harvested rice that had been left in the field by local farmers. When they finally reached the first big bundle, Onoda carefully pulled 2 torches from his pack. See, when Onoda had first been sent to Lubang, his orders were very clear. He was to destroy the island's airfield and do everything he could to disrupt the enemy. But almost immediately, the mission had gone completely sideways. Allied forces, the enemy of the Japanese, had launched a surprise attack on the island. The Japanese forces had been forced into a chaotic evacuation, and in the confusion, Onoda and Kozuka had been left behind. They had no idea if any other Japanese soldiers had also been stranded, but for the moment, it was just the 2 of them. Even though they were cut off with no idea if they'd ever be rescued, they still had their mission. Their job was to fight, to attack the enemy in any way they could. And these bundles of rice right in front of them, they knew exactly where this food was going. It was going to feed the enemy soldiers who now occupied the island. And so, their duty was to destroy it. Onoda took a moment, then lit the 2 torches. He handed one to Kozuka. They touched the flames to the first dry bundle of rice, and it went up in a whoosh of fire. Then, they started running. They sprinted across the field, stopping every few yards to set another bundle ablaze, until the entire rice field was a wall of fire and smoke. Suddenly, gunshots cracked through the air. The enemy had seen them. Onoda and Kozuka dropped their torches and immediately turned, running as fast as they could back towards the safety of the jungle. This was their routine. It was the rhythm of their entire existence. They would launch a surprise attack, cause some damage, and then retreat back into the jungle where they could hide and regroup. It was the one thing that gave their lives purpose. They were still fighting the war, and they would continue to fight until they were either killed or rescued. They were usually very good at this, experts at disappearing back into the trees before the enemy could zero in on them. But this time was different. As they were running, with bullets kicking up dirt all around them, Onoda heard Kozuka yell out from behind him. He turned just in time to see his only companion fall hard to the ground. A few weeks later, Onoda was alone. He was making his patrol along the north side of the island, just as he always did, but the silence was heavy. Kozuka had been shot and killed during their raid on the rice field. Onoda was now, almost certainly, the last Japanese soldier left on the entire island. He knew that his honor demanded he keep fighting, even by himself. But doing it alone was a whole different kind of battle. He was exhausted. He was depressed. He was surviving on stolen banana peels and whatever scraps he could get from the local farms. It was a truly miserable way to live. And things were getting worse. Ever since the Allied forces had killed Kozuka, they had somehow learned Onoda's name. They had intensified their operations, and now they were hunting for him specifically. Onoda had been forced to abandon his jungle camp and move into a small, hidden underground cave he'd found. But even there, he couldn't escape. He could hear the constant drone of fighter jets flying low overhead, searching for him. Sometimes patrols of enemy soldiers would push into the jungle near his cave. He could hear them calling out his name, telling him to stop hiding and surrender. On this particular day, as Onoda was on patrol, he heard voices up ahead. He instantly dropped into a crouch, hiding behind a large boulder. Soon, 3 enemy soldiers walked into view. They had no idea he was there. Their rifles were slung casually over their shoulders, and they were laughing and joking with each other. But Onoda started to panic. He knew that sooner or later they would spot his footprints in the mud. They would track him right back to his hiding spot. A part of him, a very tired part, was ready for it all to be over, even if it meant being captured. But his training, his sense of duty, took over. He forced himself to raise his rifle, take careful aim, and fire. Months went by. Onoda could tell by the air and the trees that it was springtime. It had been weeks since he had seen any enemy soldiers on his patrols. He was holed up in his underground cave, rereading a worn-out letter he had kept from his family back home. Suddenly, he heard movement directly above him. Then, a voice called out his name. Onoda's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his rifle, ready to scramble out of the cave and start shooting. But before he could move, the person above ground began to speak again. And as Onoda listened, he realized he knew that voice. It was not an enemy soldier. Slowly, cautiously, Onoda crawled out of his cave. When he saw the person standing there, the person who had been speaking to him, he just broke down and started to weep. It was his old commanding officer, the man he had been waiting to hear from all this time. And his commander was walking toward him with a group of other soldiers, friendly Japanese soldiers. Onoda struggled to his feet. He immediately snapped to attention and gave the officer a sharp salute. He asked if he was finally allowed to go home. And the officer looked at him with a sad expression and said, yes, he could. Because it turned out the date was the 9th of March, 1974. World War II had officially ended 29 years earlier. Hiro Onoda had spent almost 3 decades fighting a war that was long over. He had been terrorizing and attacking Filipino farmers, villagers, and local police officers, all of whom he had mistaken for enemy troops. He was still living in a war that existed only in his mind. The Japanese government had presumed Onoda and Kozuka were dead years ago. But after Kozuka was killed and his body was recovered, they realized Onoda might still be out there. They sent search parties to the island to look for him. But Onoda had seen these search parties as enemy trickery, attempts to capture him. He had hidden from every single one of them. It wasn't until he heard the familiar voice of his old commanding officer, a voice he knew he could trust, that he finally came out of hiding and laid down his rifle. When Onoda finally returned to Japan, he was given a hero's welcome. But the celebration was complicated. Innocent people had died because he was on that island, believing he was still at war. He had been a hero in his own mind, but in reality, he had been terrorizing innocent people even if he didn't know it. The whole situation was incredibly sensitive. In the end, Onoda wrote an autobiography called No Surrender. He later became a rancher and moved to Brazil, where he lived until he passed away from heart failure in 2014. Around 11 o'clock at night on the 19th of April, 1958, a 22-year-old man named Frank Esco was driving his pickup truck along a coastal road in Santa Cruz, California. He had 2 of his friends with him in the truck. The road they were on was called West Cliff Drive. It was a beautiful, scenic road that snaked along the top of a cliff right next to the Pacific Ocean. During the day, the view was absolutely amazing. But tonight, Frank couldn't see much of anything. It was pitch black, and the road had no streetlights. The amazing view was completely lost in the darkness. Frank glanced over at his friends. They were both slumped over, half asleep. And to be honest, Frank was pretty close to nodding off himself. All 3 of them were completely exhausted. They had woken up early that morning, driven 50 miles from their hometown to Santa Cruz, and then spent the entire day out on the beach. Now, they were all just desperate to get home and climb into their beds. Frank, in particular, was really anxious to get back. His wife, Margaret, always waited up for him. And right now, she was pregnant with their first child. He really didn't want to keep her waiting all night. So Frank pushed his foot a little harder on the gas pedal. He sped along the dark road, trying to enjoy what little he could see of the ocean and listening to the sound of the waves crashing below. He started thinking about his wife and their baby on the way. But as he drove, he came up on a sharp curve in the road that he just didn't see in the dark. He was going way too fast. He slammed on the brakes, and the truck began to slow down, but not nearly fast enough. He jerked the steering wheel hard, trying to fight the momentum, but it was too late. The truck spun completely out of control. Frank heard his friends wake up and start screaming. He was desperately trying to keep the truck on the road, trying to pull it away from the edge of the cliff, but it was like the truck had a mind of its own. It just kept spinning towards the edge. In the last second, Frank looked out his driver's side window and saw his headlights flash across the metal guardrail, the only thing separating them from the cliff. He knew in that moment there was nothing more he could do. They slammed into the barrier with a huge crash. He felt the truck lurch forward, smashing right through the metal, and then suddenly they were weightless. He and his friends were falling off the cliff, plummeting down toward the dark ocean below. In that split second, as they were literally falling through the air, Frank squeezed his eyes shut and just screamed along with his friends. He was expecting the truck to hit the water any second. He imagined cold ocean water pouring in through the windows, the truck sinking to the bottom, and all of them drowning, completely helpless. But then, amazingly, Frank felt the truck slam into something incredibly hard. It was definitely not water. And just like that, they weren't falling anymore. There was no water pouring into the cab. Frank was completely disoriented from the impact and the darkness. He couldn't really see what was going on, but he did a quick check on himself. He seemed to be okay. He looked over at his friends, and they were also completely shaken up, but they were alive. Everyone was physically okay. Frank frantically asked them, "Are you guys good?" And his friends, still in shock, managed to say, "Yeah, we're good." Then, almost instinctively, one of his friends on the passenger side slowly opened his door. He carefully leaned out to try and see what had just happened. After a moment, the friend looked back at the other two and just said, "We're stuck on a ledge. We got caught on a ledge." For a second, all three of them just froze. It felt like if any of them moved too much, the truck might rock off the ledge and fall the rest of the way down. But the friend looked out again and said it seemed like they were stable. By some absolute miracle, they had only fallen about 20 feet down the cliff. They had landed on a wide rock ledge that jutted out from the cliff face instead of crashing all the way down into the ocean. Hitting that ledge had almost certainly saved their lives. Frank was so relieved, so amazed at their incredible luck, that he just started to laugh. All they had to do now was carefully climb out of the truck and find a way to flag down a car on the road just 20 feet above them. They were going to be okay. So, Frank's two friends climbed all the way out of the truck. They stood on the rocky ledge on the passenger side, just looking out at the ocean, thanking their lucky stars that they had survived such a horrible crash. Frank wanted to get out and join them. He decided to go out his own door, the driver's side door. But when he tried to open it, he found that it was jammed shut from the impact. So instead, he started to roll down his window so he could climb out that way. At the exact same time Frank was doing this, his friends who were standing out on the ledge turned around to look at him and see what he was doing. Through the windows of the truck, they could really only see his shadowy shape in the darkness. But they watched as he was clearly climbing out of his window, getting ready to join them on the ledge. But the instant he climbed out on the other side of the truck, the moment his body was clear of the window, it was like Frank just vanished. He was there 1 second and gone the next. For a moment, his friends were just confused. One of them called out, "Frank, where did you go? Where are you?" But there was no response. Just silence. So, very carefully, the two friends began to walk around the front of the truck to see what Frank was doing. And when they got to the other side and they saw what was there where Frank should have been standing, they were absolutely horrified. It would turn out the ledge that Frank and his friends had landed on, the very one that had just saved their lives, was not a completely solid surface. Specifically, it was porous. And in one particular spot, there was a hole. A hole just big enough for a person to fall through. And that hole was located on the immediate outside of the driver's side of the truck. That hole, the one that Frank couldn't see in the darkness when he jumped out of his window, was the entrance to an underwater sea cave. Frank had survived the incredible fall, only to fall straight into this dark cave. He had no idea what had happened. He found himself in a network of dark, wet tunnels. There was a little bit of water on the floor, but it wasn't very deep yet. He started trying to find a way out, but he quickly got lost inside the confusing maze of tunnels. His friends were up on the ledge, screaming his name. Rescuers showed up a little while later. But by the time the tide began to come in a couple of hours later, Frank was nowhere near the entrance hole. He was lost deep inside the cave. So when the water level rose, it didn't lift him up towards the exit. It just filled up the space he was trapped in. And he drowned. On the afternoon of the 19th of December, 1966, a 59-year-old man named Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim sat in a conference room inside a government building in Cairo, Egypt. He was there in his official capacity as an employee of the Egyptian government, and he was sitting at a table across from two government representatives from France. He felt incredibly nervous. He had been meeting with these same two men for the last 4 months, trying to reach an agreement with them about a very important diplomatic decision. But so far, they had not been able to make a deal. The reason for the stalemate was that these French representatives wanted Mohammed, who was the Director General of Egyptian Antiquities, to help them put together a huge exhibition in Paris. The entire exhibition was going to be about ancient Egypt. And specifically, they wanted Mohammed to loan them a collection of priceless artifacts from an ancient Egyptian pharaoh's tomb. But Mohammed was deeply afraid to loan these specific artifacts out. He, along with many other people in his field, believed that these particular artifacts were sacred. They believed they should never be transported outside of Egypt because doing so would be deeply disrespectful to the pharaoh himself. So, on this particular day, Mohammed finally decided to be completely honest with the French representatives. He looked at them and said that they were never going to reach a deal because he was simply not willing to loan out these items. He told them it felt profoundly disrespectful to the pharaoh. He knew it probably sounded a little crazy because the pharaoh had been dead for thousands of years, but that was just how he felt. And he wanted them to understand that this wasn't a negotiating tactic. This was something he could not change. Up until this point, Mohammed had been trying to find other ways to make a deal work, but he had never come right out and said that his main objection was this personal feeling of disrespect towards the long-dead pharaoh. So this was the first time the French representatives were hearing his true reason. And from Mohammed's perspective, when he said it, it looked like they almost wanted to laugh. Like they thought he had to be kidding. But when they realized Mohammed was being completely serious, their expressions changed. They shifted in their seats and looked at him with what seemed like sympathy. Then they promised Mohammed that if he loaned them the artifacts, it would not be disrespectful at all. In fact, they argued it would do the opposite. It would actually honor the pharaoh because it would allow people all over France to see and appreciate the incredible artifacts from his tomb. Mohammed and the French representatives went back and forth on this for hours. And eventually, very slowly, Mohammed did start to see their side of things. It started to make sense to him that maybe allowing France to display the artifacts wasn't an act of disrespect, but actually a way of honoring the pharaoh's legacy. And so finally, maybe against his better judgment, Mohammed officially agreed to loan out the artifacts. The deal was done, and the meeting was over. A few minutes later, Mohammed walked out of the government building and onto the busy sidewalk outside. He felt lighter than he had in months. The stressful negotiation was finally over. He didn't have to think about it anymore. It was a huge weight off his shoulders. Now, all Mohammed wanted to do was just go home. He started walking towards the parking lot where his car was parked. He stepped off the curb to head across the street, looking straight ahead, thinking about the day. And as he did, he heard a loud, blaring horn and the screeching sound of tires on pavement. And then, everything went black. It would turn out that the artifacts Mohammed had just agreed to loan out were from the tomb of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh, King Tutankhamun. And Mohammed, along with many others, believed that these artifacts were not just sacred, but that they were also cursed. This belief existed because over the years, at least 11 people who had a direct connection to the discovery and handling of these artifacts had died under mysterious or sudden circumstances. It was believed that anybody who disrespected the artifacts or the pharaoh's tomb would face King Tut's wrath. And just minutes after Muhammad finally convinced himself to go against his own gut feeling and agree to loan out these artifacts to France, he walked out of that government building in Cairo and he was hit and killed by a truck. His death made headlines all over the world. To this day, some people will say it was just a horrible, tragic accident. But others insist he was yet another victim of King Tut's curse. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Every single day, we make hundreds of small, seemingly insignificant decisions. We choose what to eat for breakfast, what road to take on our commute, what book to read before bed, or whether to strike up a casual conversation with a stranger on the bus. Most of the time, these little choices fade into the background of our lives, completely forgotten by the time we wake up the next morning. But every once in a while, one of those tiny, routine decisions sets off a massive, unstoppable chain reaction. A single choice, made in a split second of boredom, desperation, or simple curiosity, can completely reshape a person's life forever. And sometimes it does not just change their own life, it changes the lives of millions and millions of other people all around the globe. Today, we are going to look at 3 normal, everyday people who found themselves standing at these exact crossroads. They made choices that felt completely ordinary at the time, but those decisions ended up sending shockwaves through history, pop culture, and global politics. Our first story begins on a cold, gray afternoon in the year 2009 inside a quiet, dimly lit manga cafe in the bustling city of Seoul, South Korea. A 38-year-old man named Hwang Dong-huk was sitting in a small, private wooden booth, staring blankly at the wall. A manga cafe is a very popular place in South Korea where people can go to escape the noise and stress of the city. You can buy cheap snacks, sip on hot drinks, and browse through massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with thousands of manga volumes, which are essentially Japanese comic books. It is a place designed for quiet comfort and cheap relaxation, but on this particular day, Hwang Dong-hyuk was anything but relaxed. The truth was, he was completely broke. He did not have enough money to buy a cup of coffee or a small snack from the cafe counter. He had only come inside because it was a warm, quiet place to sit and escape the harsh, unforgiving reality of his daily life. At 38 years old, his life was in complete shambles. For his entire adult life, he had dreamed of becoming a successful writer and film director. He had spent years studying the craft, working long hours on various movie sets, and trying to get his scripts noticed by major production companies. He had successfully landed a few small temporary jobs here and there, writing a script or directing a minor project, but the entertainment industry in Seoul was incredibly competitive and unpredictable. Every single time he thought he was finally making progress, the project would suddenly fizzle out, the funding would dry up, and he would find himself right back where he started, completely unemployed. At this point in his life, he was completely out of options and drowning in debt. He lived in a tiny, cramped apartment with his elderly mother and his grandmother. Even though all 3 of them pooled every single penny they had, they still struggled to pay their monthly rent and keep the heating on. The financial stress was absolutely crushing, hanging over him like a dark cloud. Just a few weeks prior, Hwang had been forced to make a heart-wrenching decision. He had to sell his laptop, which was his most prized possession, and the only tool he had to write his scripts. He sold it for a fraction of what it was worth, just so his family would not get evicted onto the cold streets. To make matters worse, he had started taking out short-term, high-interest loans just to buy basic necessities like white rice and medicine. He had absolutely no way of paying them back, and the debt was piling up like a mountain, with predatory debt collectors constantly calling his phone. The anxiety was so intense that he could barely sleep. The only way he could find even a temporary moment of peace was to escape into the world of manga. So, on this afternoon, he went to the cafe's library shelves, searched through the volumes, and pulled down a copy of his absolute favorite manga series. It was a highly controversial and incredibly violent survival story called Battle Royale. The story follows a class of high school students who are forced by a ruthless authoritarian government to fight each other to the death on a deserted island until only one survivor remains. The manga was notorious for its graphic violence and dark psychological themes, but to Huang, it was a masterpiece. It was so over-the-top and dramatic that it allowed him to completely forget about his own miserable life, if only for an hour. As he sat in his booth, turning the pages and reading the story for the 20th time, a sudden thought struck him. He looked at the pages, showing characters fighting for survival, and then he thought about his own desperate situation. He thought about the crushing weight of his debt, the feeling of absolute hopelessness, and the sheer desperation that consumed him every single day. He realized that there were millions of people in South Korea and all over the world who were experiencing this exact same kind of financial desperation. And then he had a massive epiphany. What if he wrote a story that combined the extreme high-stakes survival elements of Battle Royale with the harsh modern reality of extreme poverty? He started thinking about his childhood, playing innocent street games like the Squid Game, Red Light, Green Light, and the Dalgona Candy Challenge with his friends. Back then, the only stakes were who got to be the king of the playground. But what if, instead of high school students forced to fight by a government, the story was about ordinary, deeply indebted adults who willingly signed up to play these innocent childhood games for a massive cash prize? They would know that losing meant death, but their real lives were already such a living hell that they were willing to take the risk. The idea was so brilliant and so raw that it made his hands shake. He did not have his laptop anymore, but he had a cheap pen and some scraps of paper. He leaned over the table in his booth and began to write furiously. He sketched out characters, came up with ideas for different games, and outlined a complex, dark narrative about human nature and greed. He wrote for hours and hours, completely losing track of time. By the time the cafe manager tapped on his shoulder to tell him they were closing, Huang had a complete, detailed outline of a brand new world. Over the next several months, Huang worked tirelessly to turn this outline into a full, polished script. He had to write much of it by hand on yellow legal pads, but he poured his entire soul into it. He was absolutely convinced that this script was his masterpiece, the one project that would finally pull his family out of poverty. But when he finally finished the script and began pitching it to investors and production studios, his dreams were completely shattered. Every single buyer he met with rejected it immediately. They told him the script was way too weird, far too dark, and completely unrealistic. They said that a story about desperate people murdering each other in children's games was too grotesque for television and that no mainstream audience would ever want to watch it. For 10 long years, Hwang Dong-hook carried that script with him everywhere he went. He remained broke, his family continued to struggle, and he was forced to take on low-paying menial jobs just to survive. He often had to skip meals, and the shame of being unable to support his mother and grandmother ate away at him. But despite all the rejections and the constant self-doubt, he refused to throw the script away. He knew in his gut that the story was powerful, and that people who had experienced real struggle would relate to the themes of desperation and survival. Then, fast forward to the year 2019. Out of nowhere, a major global production studio decided to take a massive gamble. They looked at Hwang's script and saw something unique. They bought the rights to the story and put it into production as a high-budget television series. 12 years after Hwang Dong-hyuk had sat in that manga cafe, broke and hopeless, his vision was finally brought to life. In September of 2021, the show premiered. Almost overnight, the series became a monumental global phenomenon. It completely dominated the internet, becoming the most-watched show in the history of the streaming platform. It sparked thousands of memes, merchandise lines, and discussions about economic inequality in modern society. The show ultimately generated over $900 million in value for the production company. And as for Hwang Dong-hook, his life was changed forever. He was finally able to pay off all his debts, buy a beautiful home for his mother and grandmother, and secure his place as one of the most respected writers and directors in the industry, even winning a prestigious Emmy Award for his direction. The manga series that started it all was Battle Royale, and the global phenomenon that Huang created was called Squid Game. It all happened because a desperate man with no money in his pocket made the simple decision to walk into a cafe and read his favorite comic book. It is truly amazing how a single afternoon in a manga cafe could lead to one of the biggest television shows in human history. But now, let us travel back to a different time and place, to the hot summer of 1953 in the city of Memphis, Tennessee. Inside a small, unassuming brick building on Union Avenue, a 30-year-old man named Sam Phillips was busy cleaning up his recording studio. The studio was called Sun Records, and it was Sam's pride and joy. Memphis was a city bursting with musical energy, a place where gospel, blues, country, and rhythm and blues were constantly blending together on the street corners and in the local clubs. Sam was a deeply passionate music lover who believed that the big, established record labels in New York and Los Angeles were completely out of touch with the raw, authentic music of the American South. He wanted to capture that raw energy, but he did not have the money or the connections to sign big-name acts. So, Sam came up with a very unique and highly unusual business model. He decided to open up his recording studio to absolutely anyone who walked off the street. He set up a policy where anyone could walk into Sun Records at any time, hand him exactly $4, and in exchange, Sam would record them professionally and press their song onto a double-sided acetate disc. Sam hoped that by casting such a wide net, he would eventually find a rare, undiscovered talent, a star that could put his studio on the map. But the reality of this business model was incredibly grueling. Most of the people who paid the $4 were not talented at all. They were amateur singers who sang completely out of key, played their instruments poorly, and left Sam sitting in the control room with a massive headache. On this particular summer afternoon, Sam had just finished recording a local church choir, which had gone reasonably well, and now he was sweeping up the dust, wrapping up heavy microphone cables, and resetting his recording equipment, hoping that someone interesting would walk through the door. And then, the door opened, and an 18-year-old kid walked inside. The kid was dressed in simple work clothes, covered in grease and sweat from his day job, and he had a cheap acoustic guitar slung over his shoulder. Sam had never seen him before, and right away he could tell the kid was incredibly shy. He stood near the entrance, nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other, barely making eye contact with Sam. The young man walked up to the reception desk and met Sam's assistant, a woman named Marion Keisker. She asked him what kind of singer he was, and the kid replied that he sang all kinds. When she asked who he sounded like, he famously looked down and said that he did not sound like nobody. Sam greeted him warmly and asked how he could help him. The young man cleared his throat and explained in a very soft, polite voice that he worked as a truck driver for a local electrical supply company called Crown Electric. He said that he loved to play the guitar and sing in his spare time, and that he wanted to use the $4 service to record a couple of traditional, slow ballads as a birthday gift for his beloved mother, Gladys. Sam, always welcoming, smiled and told him to step right into the recording booth. The kid handed over his $4, walked into the small booth, and positioned himself in front of the microphone. Sam went back into the control room, put on his headphones, and prepared himself for what he assumed would be a very average, mediocre performance. But the moment the kid struck the first chord on his guitar and began to sing, Sam's jaw practically hit the floor. The transformation was absolute. The incredibly shy, awkward teenager who had just been mumbling at the front door completely vanished. In his place was an artist of unbelievable depth and power. His voice was incredibly rich, warm, and filled with a deep, soulful emotion that seemed far beyond his 18 years. He sang the slow ballads with perfect control and a hauntingly beautiful tone that filled the entire studio. Sam sat in the control room completely paralyzed, listening to this truck driver sing. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was listening to someone truly extraordinary. When the recording was finished, the young man stopped singing and just like that, the magic vanished. He instantly reverted back to being a shy, polite teenager. He stepped out of the booth, thanked Sam quietly, took his newly pressed acetate disc, and walked out into the hot Memphis sun. Once the kid was gone, Sam sat in the silence of his studio, his heart racing. He reached for his notepad where he kept track of the people who came into the studio, and he wrote down a quick, urgent note to himself. It read, "Good ballad singer. Save." He knew he had to keep this kid in mind for the future. Fast forward to the summer of 1954, about a year after that fateful afternoon. Sam was back in the studio, working with a local country music band. They were trying to record a few tracks, but the session was going terribly. The band was talented, but they felt like their instrumental tracks were flat and lacked a strong, defining lead voice to pull everything together. They asked Sam if he knew of any vocalists in the area who might be able to help them. Sam's studio manager, who had been present during the young truck driver session the year before, immediately jumped in. She reminded Sam of the shy 18-year-old who had recorded the ballads for his mother, insisting that his voice was one of the best she had ever heard. Sam agreed and decided to give the young man a call. The kid was thrilled to get the invitation and rushed down to the studio to meet the band. But when they began to play, the session was a complete disaster. The young man was still a fantastic singer, but he and the band had absolutely no chemistry. They had just met, and they were trying to play standard, highly structured country and pop songs. The kid's slow, expressive ballad style did not fit the up-tempo, rigid rhythm of the band at all. It sounded stiff, awkward, and completely lifeless. Sam watched from the control room, feeling the tension rise. After several failed attempts, he could see that everyone was getting frustrated and tired. He decided to call for a quick break to let everyone clear their heads. The band members and the young singer put down their instruments and walked out of the live room to grab a cold drink and step outside. Sam walked into the adjacent control room to sit in silence and try to figure out how to salvage the session. The control room did not have a window looking into the live booth, so he was completely cut off from seeing what was happening in there. But then, through the heavy walls of the studio, Sam heard a faint sound. It turns out that the young singer had gone back into the recording booth alone while the band was still outside. He had picked up his acoustic guitar and started playing an old blues song called "That's All Right," which had originally been recorded by an artist named Arthur Crudup. But the kid was not playing it like a traditional blues song. He was playing it incredibly fast, with a driving, bouncing, energetic rhythm that was completely unique. He was tapping on the wood of his guitar, creating a beat that made it impossible not to move. Hearing the upbeat noise, the band members ran back into the booth, grabbed their instruments, and began to play along with him, caught up in the pure, unadulterated joy of the sound. Sam stood up in the control room, his ears ringing with this incredible, loud, kinetic music. He ran out of the control room, threw open the door to the recording booth, and what he saw absolutely took his breath away. The shy, quiet truck driver was leaping around the room, totally lost in the rhythm, strumming his guitar with a wild, infectious energy. His voice was pouring out of him with a raw, electric power, a perfect blend of soulful blues and energetic country swing. It was a sound that Sam had never heard in his entire life, a completely new kind of music that defied any existing genre. Sam stood there with goosebumps covering his arms, realizing that this was the exact sound he had been searching for his entire life. He shouted to the band to keep playing exactly what they were playing, quickly turned on the recording equipment, and captured the track on tape that very night. When the song was played on a local Memphis radio station a few days later, the station was completely flooded with phone calls from listeners demanding to hear it again. The young truck driver became a sensation overnight, launching a career that would completely revolutionize the music industry and pop culture forever. The studio was Sun Records, and the young truck driver who spent $4 to record a song for his mother was none other than Elvis Presley, the future king of rock and roll. It is truly mind-blowing to think that the entire history of rock and roll was set in motion because a young man wanted to make a thoughtful birthday gift for his mother. But our third story takes us to a very different kind of arena, where a single, high-stakes decision in a boxing ring completely transformed a man's reputation and paved his way to leading an entire nation. Our story takes place on the evening of March 31st, 2012, in the city of Ottawa, Canada. Inside a massive, brightly lit convention center, a 40-year-old man named Justin was standing in the corner of a professional boxing ring. The arena was packed to the brim with hundreds of screaming spectators, and television cameras were swooping overhead, broadcasting the event to thousands of viewers across the country. Justin was incredibly nervous. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, and his hands were sweating inside his heavy boxing gloves. This was easily the most important athletic event of his life, but it was also, terrifyingly, the very first time he had ever stepped into a boxing ring for an actual fight. He was a complete amateur, and he knew that his entire reputation and future were on the line. The match was a highly publicized charity event called the Fight for the Cure, designed to raise funds for cancer research. But there was also a massive political rivalry at play. Justin was a young, ambitious member of parliament, and his opponent was a conservative senator. The fight was viewed by the media as a symbolic battle between two opposing political ideologies and personalities. It was a clash between the progressive, young liberal and the older, traditional conservative. Justin looked across the ring and locked eyes with his opponent. His opponent's name was Brass Knuckles Brazil, although his real name was Patrick Brazeau. He was a highly intimidating figure who had served in the Canadian military and held a black belt in karate. He was notorious for possessing an incredibly strong, bone-shattering punch, which is how he had earned the nickname Brass Knuckles Brazil. He was several pounds heavier than Justin, with broad shoulders and a reputation for raw physical aggression. During the pre-fight weigh-in, the contrast between the two men could not have been more obvious. Brass Knuckles Brazil stood there shirtless, showing off his muscular, tattooed physique, looking like a professional gladiator. Justin, on the other hand, looked lean and relatively average, leading the media and the public to completely write him off before the match even started. Almost everyone who was following the fight believed that Brass Knuckles Brazil was going to absolutely destroy Justin. And it was not just because of his opponent's military background and martial arts skills, but because of Justin's own public reputation. To the Canadian public, Justin was viewed as a soft, pampered, and incredibly privileged intellectual. He was the son of a highly famous former prime minister, and most people believed he had lived a life of luxury, completely insulated from any real physical hardship or conflict. He was seen as a lightweight, a handsome and charming man who lacked any real toughness or grit, often dismissed as a mere drama teacher who had stumbled into politics. The idea of him entering a boxing ring against a military veteran was seen as a joke. When Justin had first entered the ring that night, the sports announcers on television did not even try to hide their skepticism. They openly mocked his appearance, his fancy hair, and his bright red boxing trunks. They immediately gave him the mocking nickname of the Shiny Pony, laughing about how quickly he was going to get knocked out by a tough military veteran like Brass Knuckles Brazil. They predicted that the fight would not even last past the first round. But what the announcers and the public did not know was that the Shiny Pony had been training quietly and intensely for months. He had spent hours in local gyms, sweating, lifting weights, and practicing his punches, determined to prove to the world that he was much tougher than his pampered image suggested. He had learned how to take a punch, how to move his feet, and how to maintain his breathing under intense pressure. The bell rang for the first round, and the fight began. Justin, fueled by pure adrenaline, charged across the ring and immediately started throwing wild, heavy punches. But his technique was chaotic, and Brass Knuckles Brazil easily slipped and ducked away from every single blow. And then the counterattack came. Brass Knuckles Brazil stepped forward and began to pummel Justin with brutal, precise force. He landed heavy, painful punches to Justin's ribs, chest, and face. Justin's head snapped back under the impact of the blows, and he quickly found himself completely overwhelmed, bleeding from his nose and mouth, and desperately clinging to his opponent just to stay upright. The heavy gloves of the military veteran felt like blocks of cement hitting his jaw. The announcers on television were practically laughing, calling the match a complete slaughter and mocking Justin for ever thinking he could step into a ring with a real fighter. They commented that the shiny pony was about to be sent to the pasture. Justin was in absolute agony, his vision spinning, and he was on the absolute verge of falling to the canvas. His body wanted to give up, and his brain was telling him to lie down and let the pain stop. But right before Brass Knuckles, Brazil could land a decisive knockout punch, the bell rang, signaling the end of the first round. Justin stumbled back to his corner, his legs shaking. The ringside medic immediately rushed in to clean the blood off his face, and his coach leaned in, shouting instructions and trying to get him to focus. But Justin could barely hear a word. His head was throbbing, and he was in deep physical shock. But amid all the pain and the roaring of the crowd, a clear, powerful realization came over him. He knew that if he quit now, or if he allowed himself to get easily knocked out in the second round, his public life would be completely over. He would permanently be branded as a joke, a weak, pampered coward who tried to act tough on national television and got humiliated. He knew that the only way to save his reputation was to fight with absolute, reckless abandon. He had to stop trying to box defensively and simply fight for his life. The bell rang for the second round. Justin stood up, wiped the blood from his eyes, and charged back out into the center of the ring. But this time, his energy was completely different. He was fast, relentless, and completely focused. He went straight at Brass Knuckles Brazil, throwing a rapid barrage of heavy punches. And to the absolute shock of everyone in the arena, his punches began to land. He struck Brass Knuckles Brazil with a series of powerful, stinging blows to the head and body. The military veteran was caught completely off guard, expecting Justin to be timid and defeated after the beating he had taken in the first round. Instead, he was facing a man who seemed completely possessed and utterly unafraid of pain. Justin kept moving forward, landing hit after hit, driving his opponent back against the ropes. He used his height advantage to keep the veteran at a distance, landing jab after jab with incredible accuracy. The crowd in the convention center erupted into a deafening roar. The sports announcers were in complete disbelief, shouting into their microphones as the shiny pony completely dominated the round. By the time the bell rang to end the second round, it was Brass Knuckles Brazil who was stumbling back to his corner, gasping for air and looking completely stunned. During the brief rest period, Justin stood in his corner, his chest heaving. He looked across the ring and saw that his opponent was avoiding his gaze, looking exhausted, defeated, and deeply shaken. Justin knew that he had won the mental battle. The bell rang for the third and final round. Justin did not hesitate for a second. He charged across the canvas and unleashed a brutal, unstoppable attack on Brass Knuckles Brazil, landing powerful punches to his face over and over again. Finally, Justin landed a massive, bone-crushing right hook directly to his opponent's nose. The impact was so severe that the man's nose completely shattered and blood began to pour down his face. The referee immediately stepped in, pushed Justin back, and stopped the fight. It was a technical knockout victory. The shiny pony had won the match. The arena went absolutely wild, and the victory became the single biggest news story in Canada the next day. While the fight was officially just a charity event to raise money, the true significance of the match was deeply political. Justin had taken a massive, incredibly risky gamble to completely redefine how the entire nation viewed him. By stepping into the ring against a highly formidable opponent, taking a brutal beating, and fighting his way to a dominant victory through sheer grit and determination, he completely shattered his image as a soft, pampered intellectual. The public now saw him as a tough, resilient, and charismatic fighter who was capable of standing his ground and overcoming impossible odds. They realized that he had played a brilliant strategic game, intentionally letting his opponent wear himself out in the first round before launching his own offensive. Justin used this incredible surge of national popularity and respect to launch a massive political campaign, eventually leading his party to a historic victory and getting elected as the Prime Minister of Canada. His full name is Justin Trudeau, and his opponent in that legendary match was Patrick Brazeau, referred to during the broadcast as Brass Knuckles Brazil. It all started because a man, nicknamed the Shiny Pony, decided to step into a boxing ring to prove to his country that he was a fighter. These three stories, as different as they are, all share a powerful and inspiring truth. They show us that our lives are not completely defined by our current circumstances, no matter how difficult, painful, or hopeless they might seem. A broke writer sitting in a quiet cafe with debt collectors calling his phone, a young truck driver who was far too shy to make eye contact with a stranger, and a politician openly mocked by his entire country as a pampered, weak, lightweight. None of them could have predicted where their simple choices would lead them on that day. But by choosing to take a chance, to step out of their comfort zones, and to push forward through the rejection, the physical pain, and the overwhelming doubt, they completely rewrote their destinies. Their decisions did not just change their own lives, they created iconic art, revolutionary music, and political history that will endure for generations to come. It is a powerful reminder that the smallest, most routine choices we make today might just be the very first step on a massive journey that changes everything. We should never underestimate the power of a single moment or a single decision to transform our world forever. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was the 4th of July, 2018. A paramedic was making his way through the busy hallways of a hospital in England when one of his supervisors stopped him. She had a very serious look on her face. She looked at him and asked if he had been part of the response team for a specific call that had come in a few days earlier. The paramedic thought for a second, then nodded. He said yes, he had been on that call. He didn't think much of it at the time. The call itself had felt pretty routine, so he couldn't imagine why his supervisor was singling this one out. But the moment he confirmed it, her expression grew even more urgent. She told him she would explain everything in a moment, but first, he needed to take off all of his gear. Every single piece of it. He needed to do it right now. The supervisor explained there was a very real possibility that the uniform he was wearing could kill him. The story really begins a few days earlier, on the afternoon of the 29th of June 2018. A 44-year-old woman named Dawn Sturgis was sitting on a blanket in a park in the city of Salisbury, England. She was with a few of her friends and her boyfriend, a man named Charlie Rowley. They were drinking some wine, just enjoying a nice Friday afternoon. This was one of Dawn's favorite things to do, especially because it meant spending time with Charlie. They had been dating for about 16 months, and she was deeply in love with him. For Dawn, Charlie was like the one true bright spot in what had been a very difficult life. Dawn had struggled for years with alcoholism and an undiagnosed case of bipolar disorder. Because of these challenges, she found it hard to keep a steady job. For the past couple of years, she had been living in a therapeutic group home, a place meant to help people get back on their feet. It was shortly after she moved in there that she met Charlie. Now, if you just looked at their situations on paper, you wouldn't think they were a good match. Charlie had his own struggles. He was addicted to heroin, he didn't have a job, and he often found himself in trouble with the law. When they first started seeing each other, the people in Dawn's life were worried. They thought Charlie would just drag her further down, making her own problems even worse. But against all odds, they made each other genuinely happy. They spent almost all their time together, either at her place or his, or just hanging out in the park with their friends. This newfound happiness with Charlie had inspired Dawn. It made her want to make some real positive changes in her life. She was still drinking, but she had finally gotten a proper diagnosis for her bipolar disorder and was on medication that was helping her feel stable for the first time in a very long time. She was even making plans to move out of the group home and get her own apartment soon. She saw it as a chance for a true, fresh start. To celebrate all these positive steps, Dawn had planned a get-together with her family. It was scheduled for just a few days away, and she was excited to show them how much better she was doing. She really wanted Charlie to be there with her. In her mind, their relationship was a huge part of why she felt so motivated to turn her life around. But right at this moment, sitting in the park on this Friday, despite how much she loved Charlie and how excited she was for their future, she was actually very angry with him. Before they had come to the park, Charlie and some of their friends had done heroin and other drugs. And now, under the influence, Charlie was being a complete jerk. Dawn had recently bought some new hair dye because she wanted a new look for the family gathering. She wanted to look her best. But Charlie, high as a kite, thought it would be funny to waste the dye by putting it all over his beard and in his eyebrows. He was doing it as a joke, but Dawn wasn't laughing. She was furious. It wasn't just about the wasted dye. It was about what it represented. She knew that with his beard and eyebrows dyed some ridiculous color, Charlie would look like a mess when he met her family for the first time. This meeting was incredibly important to her. She tried to explain this to him, to tell him why she was so upset. After she confronted him, Charlie did go and try to wash the dye out. He managed to get most of it off his face, but the damage was done. Dawn still felt so annoyed by the whole thing. It felt like he didn't understand how much this meant to her. Why would he do something so stupid and risk ruining this important moment? In the end, even after he had cleaned himself up, she just couldn't let it go. She stood up, grabbed her things, and just stormed off, leaving Charlie and their friends behind to pack up the blanket and the rest of their stuff. She was just done for the day. Hours later, around 10 o'clock that night, Dawn was lying on the couch in Charlie's living room. She was listening to Charlie and their friend, a man named Sam Hobson, talk about how unpredictable and unfair life could be. Dawn was still feeling a bit irritated with Charlie, but for the most part, her good mood had returned. After she had left the park in a huff, she had gone back to her place and used what was left of the hair dye on her own hair. Then, she had called her mom. Dawn had 3 children of her own, 2 of whom were already adults. But her youngest child was in the custody of Dawn's own mother. During the phone call, Dawn had asked if maybe her youngest could come to the family get-together tomorrow. Her mother had said yes, and that made Dawn really happy. She was looking forward to seeing everyone. But right now, all she really wanted was to go to sleep. She pushed herself up from the couch and started to make her way to the bathroom to get her nightly medication. Getting there was a challenge in itself. She had to carefully step over and around all the junk and random items that were scattered all over the floor of Charlie's apartment. Charlie had a habit of going out and finding things on the street or in dumpsters and bringing them home. Sometimes he would sell what he found, but a lot of it just ended up piling up, making the apartment incredibly cluttered. Dawn managed to navigate the maze of stuff, got her pills from the bathroom, and made her way back to the couch. She swallowed the medication with a bit of water and then laid back down, settling into the cushions. Within minutes, she was fast asleep. The next morning, Dawn woke up on Charlie's couch just a little before 9:30. She had a slight hangover, just a dull headache, but by her standards, it wasn't too bad. She hadn't drunk that much the day before, so she considered it a decent start to her day. A few minutes later, Charlie walked into the living room. He sat down on the couch next to her and wished her good morning. Between her headache and her lingering annoyance from yesterday's hair dye incident, Dawn really wasn't in the mood to talk to him. But before she could say anything, Charlie's eyes suddenly lit up. He told her he had almost forgotten something. He had a present for her, something he'd gotten a few days ago. With that, he jumped up and disappeared into the kitchen. He came back, holding a small box, which he presented to her. He said it was her gift. This completely changed Dawn's mood. All her irritation just melted away. Dawn didn't receive gifts very often. She had plenty of friends who cared about her, but like her and Charlie, they didn't have a lot of money to spare. So, getting a gift was a rare and special event for her. To be getting one now, out of the blue, was incredibly exciting. She smiled a huge, genuine smile and carefully lifted the lid off the box. Inside, nestled in the packaging, was what looked like a very expensive bottle of perfume. She gasped when she saw it. The bottle looked brand new and fancy. She knew she could never have afforded something like this for herself. She was honestly shocked that Charlie had managed to get it for her. She couldn't imagine how he had done it. Dawn threw her arms around Charlie and gave him a big hug. She told him she absolutely loved it. She carefully took the bottle out of the box. She sprayed a little bit of the perfume onto one of her wrists, then rubbed her wrists together. She sniffed it and thought it smelled wonderful. So elegant. Then she handed the bottle back to Charlie and asked him to put it somewhere safe for her. With a big smile still on her face, she stood up from the couch and went to find her makeup bag. It was time to get ready for the day. About 5 minutes later, Dawn was sitting back on the couch. She had her makeup bag in her lap and was applying foundation to her face. As she worked, she was chatting with Charlie, telling him she was thinking about adding another streak of color to her hair, maybe a blue one this time. But just as she finished with her foundation and reached for her powder, she felt her headache from the morning suddenly get much, much worse. She winced, closing her eyes and hoping the sharp pain would pass. But it didn't. Soon, she started to feel lightheaded and dizzy. She also realized she was sweating, a lot more than she should have been. She stopped talking about her hair and told Charlie that she was feeling really weird. Charlie looked concerned. He asked her if she wanted him to get her some painkillers, but Dawn just shook her head no. She had already taken her prescribed medication for the day and didn't want to take any more pills, worried it might upset her stomach. Instead, she handed her makeup bag to Charlie and asked him to put it back in the bedroom for her. Then she hurried towards the bathroom, planning to splash some cold water on her face. By the time she got into the bathroom and turned on the tap, her whole body felt like it was on fire. She was sweating so profusely that just splashing water on her face didn't feel like it was helping at all. The feeling was overwhelming. So, on instinct, she just climbed right into the empty bathtub. She figured the cold, hard surface of the tub would feel good against her hot skin and might help her cool down. But as soon as she lay down inside the tub, she felt her breath catch in her chest. It was becoming hard to breathe. Back in the living room, Charlie heard Dawn moving around in the bathroom. He heard the water turn on, then off again, and then the sound of her rustling around. He was a little worried about her, but he also knew that she got hangovers from time to time, and she had clearly woken up with one today. He figured this was just a really bad one. Besides, he was feeling a bit off himself and really wanted to leave. He had plans to meet up with his friend Sam to get some more heroin. He knew that would take the edge off his own headache and nausea. But before he could get up to leave, he heard a strange sound coming from the bathroom. At first, he couldn't quite place it. It was a kind of gurgling noise. Then he realized what it was. At that point, all thoughts of leaving vanished. He jumped to his feet and rushed to the bathroom door. When he threw it open, he gasped at what he saw. Dawn was lying in the empty bathtub, fully clothed, and there was foam coming from her mouth. She was frothing. Charlie had no idea what was happening, but his instincts took over. He ran over to her, pulled her out of the tub, and gently laid her down on the bathroom floor. He could tell she was basically unconscious. Her body was limp. He leaned in close to her face and listened, but he couldn't tell if she was even breathing. In that moment, Charlie knew this was not a hangover. This was something far more serious. He scrambled to find a phone and immediately dialed the emergency line. When the dispatcher answered, Charlie frantically tried to explain what was going on. He told them his girlfriend Dawn had just collapsed in the bathtub out of nowhere. The operator got his address and assured him they would send paramedics right away. But they also told Charlie that he needed to perform CPR on Dawn while he waited for help to arrive. The dispatcher then started giving him instructions over the phone, telling him exactly what to do. Charlie was terrified, but he took a deep breath and tried to follow their directions. He had to help Dawn. He kept the phone on speaker beside him as he straddled Dawn's chest and began giving her compressions. It felt like an eternity, but it was an agonizing 19 minutes before a single paramedic finally walked through the door. By that time, Dawn's skin had started to turn a terrifying shade of blue. Charlie paced anxiously around his small apartment while the paramedic took over the chest compressions. He could hear the paramedic on his radio calling for more backup. And sure enough, just a few minutes later, more paramedics arrived and streamed into the apartment. At first, seeing more medical professionals made Charlie feel a little hopeful. He thought that more help meant a better chance that Dawn was going to be okay. But then, from his spot in the living room, he overheard one of the paramedics say something about drugs. They were talking about the possibility of an overdose. As soon as Charlie heard that, he called out to them, insisting that Dawn didn't do drugs. But in the chaos of the small bathroom, the paramedics didn't seem to hear him. A second later, their voices became more urgent. They were using a lot of medical terms that Charlie didn't understand, but he did catch one phrase very clearly. Dawn's heart had stopped. The paramedics worked tirelessly and were eventually able to get her heart beating again. But it took them more than an hour to get her stable enough to be moved from the apartment to the hospital. Charlie just watched, completely panicked and filled with despair, as they loaded his girlfriend onto a stretcher. He followed them out of the apartment, wanting to stay by Dawn's side for as long as he possibly could. Just before they closed the doors of the ambulance, he leaned in close to her and told her that he would meet her at the hospital. He promised. As the ambulance doors shut and the sirens blared to life, Charlie's friend Sam appeared. He looked completely shocked by all the commotion. They had made plans to go to a church event that day, one that was offering free food. Charlie had completely forgotten about it. He quickly told Sam everything that had just happened and explained that he couldn't go to the event. He needed to get to the hospital as fast as he could to be with Dawn. But even as he was saying the words out loud, a harsh reality set in. He knew he couldn't just go straight to the hospital. If he went there now, he had no idea how long he would be there. And since he was addicted to heroin, he knew that if he didn't get some drugs into his system soon, he would start to get incredibly sick from withdrawal. Charlie felt completely trapped. He didn't know what to do. The stress and fear were so overwhelming that he felt like he was on the verge of a complete breakdown. This was all just too much to handle. But then he remembered something. He had a prescription for methadone waiting for him at the local pharmacy. Methadone is a medication often given to people addicted to heroin who are trying to get clean. It helps manage the addiction and the severe symptoms of withdrawal. It mimics some of the effects of the drug on the body, but without providing the euphoric high. Charlie hadn't actually gotten around to filling his methadone prescription yet, mostly because getting clean hadn't been his top priority. But now, as he thought about needing to be at the hospital all day, needing to be coherent and able to talk to doctors and nurses and be there for Dawn, an idea formed. He thought if he went and got his methadone and took it, it would keep him from getting sick from withdrawal, but it would also allow him to keep a clear head. He could be present and helpful at the hospital. So Charlie turned to Sam and asked if he would come with him on a different trip, a trip to the pharmacy to pick up his methadone. A couple of hours later, at around 3:30 inches the afternoon, Charlie and Sam got back to Charlie's apartment. It had been an incredibly hot day, and after walking all over town, they were both dripping with sweat. After they had gone to the pharmacy, Charlie and Sam had actually stopped by that church event. They didn't go for the food. They went to literally say a prayer for Dawn. Now they were back at Charlie's place. He needed to pack an overnight bag for himself and also one for Dawn to bring to her at the hospital. He still didn't know how long he would be there, but now that he had his methadone, he figured he would be okay. But as Charlie started gathering things, he found it was hard to think straight. He had a really intense headache, and even though they were inside now, he just couldn't stop sweating. Charlie thought to himself that maybe it was the methadone. He had never taken it before, and he reasoned that maybe these were just some of the side effects. He decided that he would just take a quick shower. He thought that might help clear his head and make him feel a bit more normal. But after he got out of the shower, he felt even worse. He looked at his reflection in the mirror and noticed that his pupils were constricted into tiny little pinpricks. Still, he tried to push through it. He went into his bedroom to get dressed and finish packing Dawn's bag. But as just a couple of minutes passed, he noticed his heart began to race. It got faster and faster and faster, and he couldn't seem to do anything to calm it down. Now, over the past couple of days, between the heroin and now the methadone, Charlie had consumed a lot of drugs. But he used drugs all the time, and he had never ever felt this specific combination of symptoms before. This felt different. This felt wrong. Charlie left the bedroom and walked back into the living room. He just sat down on the couch, feeling completely and utterly awful. A strange thought popped into his head. He thought, okay, this doesn't feel like the drugs. I always do drugs, and this isn't it. I've never felt like this. His eyes landed on his friend Sam, who was also in the room. And then a bizarre paranoid thought took hold. What if Sam poisoned me? What if that's what's happening here? What if I've been poisoned? Without really thinking it through, without considering how or when or why Sam would do such a thing, Charlie began to yell at him. He accused him, saying, "You poisoned me. Why did you do this to me?" Sam was completely caught off guard. He looked stunned and confused and said, "What are you talking about?" He started backing away from Charlie. But Charlie just jumped up from the couch and started to move towards Sam as if he was about to attack him. But after taking only a couple of steps, Charlie's mouth suddenly filled up with so much saliva that he couldn't speak clearly anymore. All that came out was a gurgling sound as froth spilled from his lips. Then his legs became weak and wobbly. He had to lean against the wall just to keep himself from collapsing to the floor. And then he felt his entire body begin to seize up. The very last thing Charlie was aware of was seeing his friend Sam grabbing a phone and calling for another ambulance. About an hour later, inside the emergency room of the Salisbury District Hospital, the on-call doctor stood in Charlie Rowley's treatment room. A nurse at his bedside was drawing a sample of his blood. The doctor had just finished examining Charlie, who was now unconscious. It was clear that he had suffered a seizure. He also had a high fever, his pupils were constricted, and his breathing was labored. To the doctor, it was obvious that Charlie's condition was extremely serious. But the doctor was also sure he knew exactly what had caused it. Charlie had overdosed on drugs. The doctor felt very confident in this diagnosis, especially because Charlie's girlfriend, Dawn, had been brought in that very morning and treated for the exact same thing. She had been admitted after her heart had stopped, and she had presented with many of the same symptoms that Charlie was now showing. The medical team had managed to stabilize her, but she had been admitted to the intensive care unit and was still listed in critical condition. So, the doctor felt his diagnosis for both Dawn and Charlie was solid. The symptoms fit the profile of a severe opioid overdose. Plus, the police officer in charge of both of their cases had confirmed that Charlie, at the very least, was a known drug user. And the apartment where both of them had collapsed was reportedly full of needles and other drug paraphernalia. It all seemed to point in one direction. Over the next 24 hours, neither Dawn nor Charlie showed any signs of improvement. In fact, they both got much, much worse. Their nervous systems began to completely break down. This meant that essential bodily functions, like breathing, were starting to fail. Dawn had fallen into a deep coma and was being kept alive by a life support machine. Charlie was also still unconscious, and his breathing had deteriorated so much that doctors had to put him on a ventilator to breathe for him. He had also been moved to the intensive care unit, just like Dawn. At this point, it was becoming clear to the medical staff that this probably wasn't a simple drug overdose. The way their conditions were progressing was not typical. It seemed more likely that they had taken a bad batch of drugs, maybe something that had been contaminated with a poison, or perhaps it was something else entirely. But none of the doctors or nurses could figure out what was actually wrong with them. Their cases were a complete medical mystery. By the afternoon of July 3rd, which was 3 days after Dawn and Charlie were first hospitalized, one of the doctors in the intensive care unit had officially taken over both of their cases. His name was Dr. Stephen Jukes. Dr. Jukes had reviewed the results from the initial toxicology screenings. They showed that while Charlie did have a significant amount of heroin and other drugs in his system, Dawn did not. The only things that showed up in her results were her prescribed psychiatric medications. So, Doctor, Jukes had sent more of their blood samples to a different, more specialized lab to be tested for a much wider range of drugs and toxins. He was still waiting for those results to come back, but he was starting to lose faith that they would give him the answer he was looking for. "By now, Doctor." Jukes had managed to rule out a few other possibilities that could have caused their symptoms. For a while, there was a theory that maybe the two of them had been exposed to a gas leak in Charlie's apartment. Some of the symptoms of gas poisoning are similar to what Dawn and Charlie were experiencing. But the main reason this theory didn't hold up was the timing. Dawn and Charlie had been in the apartment together on the morning she was brought to the hospital. If there was a gas leak, they presumably would have both been exposed at the same time and gotten sick around the same time. But only Dawn was affected initially. Charlie was fine. Then, Charlie left the apartment for several hours, so he was completely away from any potential source of a leak. It was only after he came back to the apartment that he started to feel sick. It just didn't add up. Also, none of the first responders who had been inside the apartment working on Dawn had reported smelling anything unusual. Of course, some dangerous gases, like carbon monoxide, are odorless, but a typical natural gas leak has a very distinct smell, like rotten eggs. Plus, there was the fact that when Charlie got sick, his friend Sam was in the apartment with him, and Sam didn't get sick at all. So, all things considered, the gas leak theory seemed highly unlikely. Doctor. Jukes had also briefly considered if what happened to Dawn and Charlie could be connected to a strange toxin exposure case that had come through that very same hospital a couple of months earlier. However, the victims in that particular case were from another country, and as far as anyone knew, Dawn and Charlie had not recently traveled outside of England. So, Doctor. Jukes had ruled that out as well. But Doctor. Jukes did have one theory that he still thought had potential. Maybe this was a case of pesticide poisoning. The symptoms were a good match. And Doctor. Jukes knew that sometimes street drugs can be accidentally or intentionally contaminated with powerful pesticides. So, if Dawn and Charlie had both taken some kind of drug that he hadn't tested for yet, it was possible they could have been exposed that way. He had already shared this theory with the police, and they had issued a press release to the public encouraging drug users to be extra cautious in case there was a contaminated supply out there. But Doctor. Jukes also knew that contaminated drugs were not the only way people could be exposed to pesticides. Simply eating, drinking, or breathing in contaminated food, water, or air could be just as fatal. This possibility was extremely troubling to Dr. Jukes and everyone else involved in the case. Because if Dawn and Charlie had been exposed to potentially deadly chemicals just by going about their normal lives in their home or their neighborhood, it meant that everyone else in their community could also be in danger. Without being able to speak to Dawn or Charlie, there was no way to know for sure where they had been, what they had touched, or what they might have ingested before they got sick. Dr. Jukes felt like he needed to get that information from somewhere else, and he needed it fast. The next morning, July 4th, 4 days after Dawn and Charlie had gotten sick, Dr. Jukes pushed open the door to a small family waiting room in the hospital. Inside, Dawn's mother, her 3 sisters, and her son were all waiting. He had heard they were there visiting Dawn, so he had asked a nurse to bring them to this room so he could speak with them privately. He was hoping they might be able to shed some light on where Dawn had been and what she might have been doing before she collapsed. As soon as he walked in, the family looked up at him with anxious expressions. He had barely gotten his name out before they started asking him questions about what was happening and why the news was portraying Dawn as some kind of drug addict. Doctor. Jukes held up his hand gently to quiet them. Once they had settled down, he explained that at the very beginning they had believed it was an overdose because her symptoms looked just like one. But now, based on how her condition had progressed, he knew that an overdose was very unlikely to be the cause. Then he told them about his theory involving pesticides and said he really needed their help. He asked them to tell him everything they could about Dawn, her habits, her health history, and the people she usually spent her time with. Dawn's mother told him she had spoken to Dawn on the phone the night before all of this had started. She said Dawn had seemed perfectly fine. She had even asked if her youngest daughter could come to the family get-together they were planning. Beyond that, though, the family admitted that they didn't know a lot about Dawn's daily life with Charlie and her friends in Salisbury. They knew she struggled with alcoholism and her mental health, and she didn't always share everything with them. They were pretty sure, however, that she rarely ever left the city. But the main thing the family wanted Dr. Jukes to understand was that Dawn was not just some nobody, the way the media was making her out to be. She was a loving mother, a sister, a daughter, and a friend. She was someone who was really, genuinely trying to do better, and she was succeeding. She didn't want much from life. She just wanted a place of her own and a little more stability. She was on the right path to get those things. They begged him not to give up on her. Dr. Jukes promised them that he wouldn't. But as he left the room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment. He was glad to know more about Dawn as a person. She sounded like a wonderful woman. But he had been desperately hoping for some kind of breakthrough, some clue about what could have possibly happened to her. And he hadn't gotten one. None of them had been able to give him any information that could begin to explain what was going on. At this point, he really wasn't sure what else he could do. As Dr. Jukes was heading back towards his office, trying to figure out his next move. He saw a lab technician rushing down the hallway towards him. The tech was holding a piece of paper and looked frantic. When he reached Dr. Jukes, he shoved the paper into his hands. The tech was out of breath, but managed to tell Dr. Jukes that he had to read this immediately. So, Dr. Jukes looked down at the paper. He saw that it was the latest lab results for Dawn and Charlie. And as he scanned the contents, he could not believe what he was reading. The new, more comprehensive blood tests he had ordered did not show the presence of pesticides or any other street drugs. But they did show something else. Something so unexpected and so incredibly dangerous that Dr. Jukes knew in an instant that Dawn and Charlie were not the only ones at risk here. Everyone was at risk. Literally everyone in Charlie's apartment building, everyone in their neighborhood, all the paramedics, all the police officers, all the doctors and nurses who had treated them, and all the other patients in the hospital. In fact, it was even possible that everyone in the entire city was now in danger, and it might already be too late. Dr. Jukes turned and sprinted down the hall towards his office. He burst through the door, grabbed the phone, and called the police. A few hours later, a man named Philip Murphy stood on the street outside of Charlie's apartment building. Murphy was the deputy head of investigations for one of England's counter-terrorism units. His team had established a wide perimeter, completely cordoning off the entire building and evacuating every single person who lived inside. Dozens of officers and highly specialized crime scene technicians were moving in and out of the building, all of them wearing bulky, full-body protective suits. They were methodically swabbing every surface and carefully collecting any potential evidence. Because of those lab tests that Dr. Jukes had run, Murphy knew exactly what substance had made Dawn and Charlie sick. But he had no idea how they could have possibly come into contact with it. And answering that question was no longer just a medical mystery or a local police matter. It was now a matter of international security. It wasn't just Murphy's counterterrorism unit that was involved now. Multiple other agencies had been brought in, including the UK's Secret Service, also known as MI5. MI5 would be responsible for dealing with the other countries that were now becoming involved in this investigation. In addition to securing Charlie's apartment, the counterterrorism unit had been deployed to the hospital. They were now requiring anyone who visited Dawn and Charlie to wear protective gear. They had contacted all of the paramedics and police officers who had interacted with them and instructed them to bag up their uniforms and all of their equipment to be treated as biohazards. Some police officers were now tasked with sifting through thousands of hours of CCTV footage from all around the city, going back several weeks looking for any sign of Dawn or Charlie. Others were contacting their friends to try and piece together a timeline of their recent movements. At least one friend had already taken officers on a tour of the park, where they had all been hanging out the day before Dawn and Charlie got sick. Murphy already had a team heading to that park to close it off and begin taking more samples. He also had another team doing the same thing at Don's home. As Murphy stood there on the street watching the officers in their white suits move in and out of Charlie's apartment, he knew that as massive as this operation already was, it was really just the beginning. He knew he was going to have to be patient. Even though the situation was clearly urgent, he also knew that it could take a very long time to figure out exactly what had happened and why. At this point, all Murphy and anyone else could do was hope that the authorities could find some answers before more people got hurt. But just 4 days later, on July 8th, Dawn Sturgis was taken off life support and passed away in the hospital. Her death was an incredible tragedy for her family. For Murphy and the investigation, it was also a major blow. He had been hoping that she might wake up, that he would get a chance to speak to her. She was a potential treasure trove of information about how this whole thing had happened. And now, he would never get that chance. On July 11th, which was 11 days after Dawn and Charlie first got sick, the situation stood like this. Dawn was now deceased, and Charlie was still alive but was unable to talk. The various agencies working on the case had managed to test and eliminate almost every location that Dawn and Charlie had visited as being the source of the toxic substance. Every place except for one. The only location they couldn't rule out was Charlie's apartment. So Murphy sent the forensics team back to the apartment to search it all over again, even more thoroughly this time. That afternoon, a lead officer with the forensics team stood in the middle of Charlie's small, cluttered apartment alongside some of his colleagues. The lead officer and his entire team were dressed in very heavy-duty advanced protective suits. They moved slowly and deliberately around the cramped space, taking new samples from surfaces and bagging anything that could be potential evidence. The sheer amount of clutter in the apartment made their job incredibly difficult. There were clothes piled up on the floor, open bags of fabric, and dirty dishes stacked high in the sink and on the kitchen counters. The trash cans were overflowing. In the bedroom, there was a mix of makeup and some empty hair dye boxes scattered on the floor, right alongside used needles and other drug paraphernalia. There wasn't a lot of furniture in the apartment, but what was there had been pushed around and was in disarray, mostly from when the paramedics had been rushing to treat Dawn. Other areas of the apartment were littered with medical debris, like discarded rubber gloves and plastic wrappers from equipment. And there were just random objects everywhere, water bottles, plastic toys, all sorts of things piled up on the windowsills. It felt like there was almost too much stuff in the apartment to even effectively test it all. But as the lead officer walked around doing his best to identify items that needed to be tested, something on a kitchen counter caught his eye. It was an object that looked very different from everything else in the apartment. It didn't seem to belong. Now, to understand what happened to Dawn and Charlie, you have to go back in time, 3.5 months before they got sick. Back then, an unrelated older man and a younger woman were found unresponsive on a park bench in Salisbury. They were brought to the Salisbury District Hospital, the very same one that Dawn and Charlie would later be taken to. When this man and woman came into the hospital, they were experiencing seizures and they couldn't stop vomiting. But after receiving treatment at the hospital, they both made a full recovery. At first, the doctors there, including Dr. Jukes, thought that this man and woman were just regular civilians who had gotten sick, maybe from a drug overdose. But it soon became clear that neither of those things was true. First, they were not just regular civilians. The older man was a former Russian spy who had defected to England, and the young woman was his daughter. And they had definitely not overdosed. They had been poisoned. A major investigation discovered that the substance used to poison them was an extremely rare and deadly chemical weapon that had been created by Russia. It was called Novichok, a type of nerve agent. And so, 3.5 months later, after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized and their conditions were getting worse and worse, that lab tech had rushed down the hallway to show Dr. Jukes their new lab results. The name of the deadly chemical that Dr. Jukes saw printed on that paper, the substance that was in their system, was Novichok. Investigators in the original spy poisoning case had never been able to figure out exactly how the poison had been administered to the spy and his daughter. But the item that Murphy's forensics team had now found on the counter in Charlie's apartment, the one that stood out and didn't look like it belonged there, was the item that finally solved that mystery. It would turn out that Charlie had found the source of the poison completely by accident. It was that brand new bottle of perfume that he had so proudly given to Dawn on the morning they both got sick. Charlie hadn't actually bought this gift at a store. He could never have afforded something so expensive. Instead, he had found it in a charity donation dumpster during one of his many dumpster diving trips. And that dumpster just so happened to be the exact same one where a Russian agent had discarded the poison delivery device after the attempted assassination of the spy and his daughter. The device had been cleverly disguised to look exactly like a high-end bottle of perfume. So when Dawn accepted Charlie's gift and, in her excitement, sprayed what she thought was perfume directly onto her wrists, she had accidentally exposed herself and, by extension, Charlie to the deadly nerve agent. Charlie would eventually recover from his exposure to the Novichok. As for the 3 Russian agents that authorities believe were involved in the attack, they returned to Russia and have never been prosecuted. Russia has consistently denied any involvement in the poisoning. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the afternoon of the 6th of May, 2008, a 54-year-old man named Ricky Williams stood on a riverbank in Western Virginia. He was casting his fishing line out into the calm waters of a place called Dismal Creek. Ricky was really hoping to catch some trout. He'd been out here for a good 30 minutes already, but so far, he hadn't gotten a single bite. Now, on a normal day, Ricky wouldn't have minded. He was the kind of guy who could fish for hours and just enjoy the peace and quiet. But today was different. Today, he and his dog, who was sitting right beside him, were seriously hungry. They'd been camping out in these woods for several weeks, and their food supply had finally dwindled down to almost nothing. So, if Ricky didn't catch any fish today, there was a very real chance neither he nor his dog would eat. For a little bit of context, the place where Ricky was fishing, Dismal Creek, had a bleak name, but it was actually a beautiful, very secluded spot. It was high up on a mountain that was part of the Appalachian Trail. And the Appalachian Trail is this very famous, very long trail, about 2,200 miles, that runs all the way up and down the east coast of the United States. What's really important about the Appalachian Trail is that there's a kind of unwritten code among the people who hike it. All the hikers know this code. It's simple. If you come across another hiker on the trail, it is your responsibility to help them if they need it. And in turn, it's their responsibility to help you if you're the one in trouble. It's like this built-in community of people who are always looking out for one another. And so, Ricky was very aware of this code. As he stood there, casting his line again and again with no luck, he was secretly hoping that a hiker, or maybe a group of them, would wander by. Maybe they'd see him, come down to the creek, find out he needed food, and just offer him some of theirs. But another half an hour went by. No hikers appeared. And still, Ricky could not catch a single fish. Then, all of a sudden, Ricky's dog started to whine. It began shifting around, almost like it could sense a predator was nearby. As Ricky was trying to calm his dog down, he heard a voice coming from the woods right behind him. Someone was definitely moving towards him. When Ricky heard this voice, he felt two things at once. On one hand, he was excited. Maybe this was finally a hiker who could give him some food. But on the other hand, Ricky couldn't shake this feeling of deep unease. You have to understand, Ricky was an older guy. He was kind of frail. And over the past few weeks, as his food had run out, he had gotten skinnier and skinnier. He really didn't pose a threat to anyone. He was just this weak, older man. Now, generally speaking, the Appalachian Trail was a very safe place. But over the last few decades, there had been several murders that took place right on the trail, And in fact, one of those killings had happened less than 2 miles away from the very spot where Ricky was fishing with his dog. In that double homicide, a very well-known killer named Randall Lee Smith had stabbed and shot 2 hikers to death. So, while Ricky was desperate for help from a fellow hiker, he couldn't help but feel a little apprehensive. Again, Ricky was a small, frail guy, and he knew all about these murders. He knew he was extremely close to one of the murder sites. And so, Ricky was totally on edge as he listened to this male voice getting closer and closer. Finally, a man in his early 30s stepped out from the tree line. He looked over and saw Ricky. For a second, the 2 men just stared at each other. But then, this guy just grinned at Ricky and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And in that instant, Ricky felt a wave of relief. He could tell just by looking at this guy that he probably wasn't a threat. The man introduced himself as Scott Johnston. He told Ricky he was actually camping in the area with a friend of his, and they were out here fishing just like Ricky was. Ricky pretty much immediately said, "Oh great, nice to meet you. Do you have any food for me?" Scott was like, "Absolutely." He dug into the bag he was carrying and pulled out a couple of energy bars and a bag of chips. He tossed them over to Ricky. He also gave Ricky some fresh bait so he could cast his line out again. For the next couple of hours, Scott and Ricky just stood there on the riverbank fishing together. And after a while, the trout actually did start biting. They started catching fish. The day was turning into a pretty great outing for Ricky. And it got even better. As soon as they were done fishing, Scott asked Ricky if he wanted to join him and his friend back at their campsite for dinner. Remember, Ricky had no food. This was an amazing invitation. He said yes, of course, he'd love to. So, the 2 men packed up their fishing gear right as the sun was starting to go down. Then, they began walking back into the forest in the same direction Scott had come from. As they were walking, Scott's fishing pole got tangled up on a low-hanging branch. He was really struggling to get it free from the tree. Finally, he just told Ricky to go on ahead. He said, "My campsite is right up there. It's a straight shot. Just go up the hill and you'll see it." Ricky asked Scott if he was sure, and Scott said, "No, it's totally fine. Go ahead." So Ricky said, "Okay," and he walked the rest of the way up the hill by himself. When he walked out of the tree line and into the clearing where Scott's campsite was, the first thing Ricky noticed was this enormous man. He looked like he was twice the size of Scott, which made him about 4 times the size of Ricky. He was kind of hunched over the campfire. This huge man, who Ricky assumed was Scott's friend, heard him walk into the clearing. You have to remember, it was getting dark, and they were kind of in the middle of nowhere. So this guy, he whipped his head around and saw this strange man just standing there at the edge of his camp. Scott was nowhere to be found. And so this big guy, he immediately grabbed a club like a thick piece of wood, and he looked at Ricky menacingly with a look that said, "What are you doing here?" Ricky was so caught off guard by just how big this guy was, he put his hands up and said, "I'm so sorry. Scott sent me up here." I don't know if this is the right site. I'm sorry. But just at that moment, Scott had finally untangled his fishing line, and he came walking out of the tree line. He saw what was happening, walked over, and patted Ricky on the back. He said, "Oh, you've already met my friend, Sean." As soon as Scott said that, Sean seemed to let his guard down. He put the piece of wood down, and he stopped glaring directly at Ricky. But Ricky got the distinct feeling that Sean was not happy that he was in his campsite, even though Scott was clearly the reason he was there. Ricky just felt really, really uncomfortable. At the same time, Scott was ushering him closer to the campfire, telling him to take a seat next to Sean. Scott was saying, "Sean's a great cook. He'll cook up this fish for us. It's going to be great. You know, take a seat." Ricky felt kind of annoyed that Scott was being so pushy, really forcing him to stay. But Ricky didn't want to be rude and just abruptly leave, so he did as he was told. He took a seat right next to Sean, who definitely was not excited to be sitting next to him. And Ricky just sort of sat there, waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next was Scott walked over to Sean and handed him all the fish that he and Ricky had caught so Sean could start preparing them for cooking. Then, as Ricky was still just sitting there right next to Sean, Scott walked away from the campfire. He went over to his truck, which was parked right next to Sean's Jeep. Scott turned on the radio and just started blasting country music. When Ricky heard this music, he kind of winced. To him, part of the reason the outdoors, the Appalachian Trail, being out in nature, part of the reason it was so wonderful was for the peace and quiet. So to him, it felt almost disrespectful to be out in the middle of this beautiful place, blaring country music. To Ricky, he just couldn't help but feel like there was something off about these two guys. They just seemed really disrespectful and kind of pushy and maybe even aggressive. So Ricky was not happy. But again, he didn't say anything. He didn't try to leave. Because again, he was really hungry, and so was his dog. He needed to eat that fish. A moment later, Scott walked back from the truck and took a seat next to Sean. Then, he and Sean both pulled out their knives and began deboning the fish. As they were doing this, Ricky again was just kind of sitting there, doing nothing. So he sort of meekly asked, "Hey, can you give me a knife? I'll clean a fish." But Sean and Scott kind of waved him off and said, "Don't worry, we got this." And so Ricky just continued to sit there nervously. All he could do was watch the firelight flashing and bouncing off their blades. But eventually, Scott and Sean finished deboning all the fish, and they put their knives away. At that point, they started cooking the fish over the open flame. And suddenly, for Rick actually, it felt like the mood had shifted a little bit. At least now, the two men weren't fiddling around with weapons. It felt kind of safe again. So Ricky started to make some small talk, hoping it would settle his nerves. He told the two men about how much he loved the Appalachian Trail and how he came out here all the time for weeks at a time with his dog. Ricky told them that sometimes he felt more at home out in the wild than he did at his actual home. It was almost like being out in nature was a religious experience for him. He even told Sean and Scott that sometimes when he was out in nature, he would meditate and pray and even do some chanting, like it was part of a ritual. He was really trying to be in tune with Mother Nature. But as Ricky continued to tell Sean and Scott about his personal life, he noticed that the two men were definitely paying attention. They were kind of nodding along at the appropriate points in his story. But at the same time, Ricky felt like these two men were also kind of looking at him like he was weird. As if they weren't prepared to say it out loud, but after hearing all these things about his life, they were thinking, what's going on with this guy? And so Ricky suddenly felt really embarrassed about being so open with these two guys who once again just seemed like they didn't quite like him or even really want him there. But luckily, right at that moment, the fish was done. And so the men just sat there in silence and wolfed down the food. By the time they finished, it was about 8 o'clock at night. It was very dark outside. And Ricky, at this point, was just ready to go. He still felt so uneasy there. So, after putting down his plate and his silverware and saying thank you to Sean and Scott for their hospitality, he quickly got up, grabbed his dog, and began walking into the woods towards his own campsite. But after Ricky and his dog had walked maybe 10 or 15 feet away from the campsite, two things happened in very rapid succession. Number one, Ricky suddenly stopped and he turned around and looked back at the campsite. And number two, right as he did this, there was this enormous bang sound, like a small explosion that echoed through the forest. About 30 minutes later, and about 4 miles away from where Ricky, Sean, and Scott had been, there were these two women. They were in their house eating dinner when they heard a sudden, frantic knocking on their front door. Now, these women lived in a very isolated part of the country, so they were very concerned. One of them rushed over to the phone just to be ready to call the police, while the other one very carefully made her way towards the front of the house. She kind of peered out the window, but she couldn't see anything outside. It was too dark. And so she went to her door, which was still getting pounded on by whoever was out there. The woman, she unlocked the door, and she opened it just a crack and what she saw nearly made her faint. There was a man standing on her porch who was absolutely covered in blood. It was as if he had been fully submerged in a tank of blood. I mean, he was all red. The man had his hand pressed over his neck, and the woman who opened the door, she looked at him and she saw that there was this rhythmic pulsing of blood pumping out from his neck in time with his heart. This man was clearly bleeding to death, and so the woman, she screamed for the other woman to please call 911. She yelled, "We have someone who's dying here." And so the other woman started calling 911. Then the man on the porch just said, "Please help me." And then he said something about Dismal Creek, and then he collapsed. This was so shocking for the woman who had opened the door that she just stood there staring, having no idea what to do. But then she happened to look up, and she noticed there was a Jeep that was idling out on the road in front of her house. She hadn't even registered it until now. So either this guy got dropped off, or he had driven that Jeep. But before she could even begin to understand what had just happened, an ambulance and a whole bunch of police cars came screaming up and parked in front of her house. The medics got out, they rushed up, and they grabbed the bleeding man, they put him in the ambulance, and they rushed him off. Meanwhile, not far from the house, police officers were speeding towards Dismal Creek. Because when the women called 911, they said, this guy who showed up on the porch bleeding said something about Dismal Creek, but they had no idea what it was about. And so, instead of trying to wait and figure out what was even going on, the police had basically said, let's just go to Dismal Creek and look around. Let's see if we can figure out why someone would leave that area and show up at this house covered in blood. But as the police were making their way up this winding mountain road, they saw a truck bombing down the road, coming straight at them. The truck, it initially hit its brakes and did kind of attempt to get out of the way of the police cars. But after this truck had basically come to a stop, the driver of the truck just hit the gas all over again. And they veered wildly off the side of the road into an embankment. The truck crashed and flipped several times and then came to a stop. The police officers who had veered to the side of the road to avoid getting hit by this truck, they just watched this happen. And they couldn't understand why the driver had gunned it again after stopping and then seemingly intentionally drove off the road. It almost seemed like the driver was trying to crash. And so the police, they got out of their cars and they approached the wrecked truck with their guns drawn. But when they looked into the vehicle, they saw there was a single occupant, the driver. And he was still somehow alive. So the police got him out of the vehicle and they called an ambulance. But they actually sent an officer with the ambulance to escort them because the police were actually pretty suspicious of this truck driver. Remember, they were going up that road to get to Dismal Creek to see what had happened there that would lead to another man showing up on somebody's doorstep in the middle of the night covered in blood. And now they have this truck driver who looks like he's speeding away from Dismal Creek, who crashes his truck. I mean, there was no clear connection between the truck crash and the bloody guy, but the police were suspicious that they had to be connected. So they sent the officer to the hospital as well. About 30 minutes after the truck crash, the police left the scene and continued the rest of the way up the road to Dismal Creek. Once they got up there, the police fanned out all across the area and just began looking for anything. Just any clue that might explain what the heck happened here, if anything had happened at Dismal Creek at all. And pretty quickly, the police actually did find something unique. In the middle of the Dismal Creek area, they found a campsite. But it was not the campsite where Sean and Scott were staying, where Ricky had gone and shared dinner with them. This was a different campsite. And not long after searching this other campsite, police concluded that whoever was staying here did not seem like they were mentally well. This seemed like a mentally unstable and potentially dangerous person lived here. The campsite itself was really simple. It was just a tent and a campfire. But when the police lifted up the flap and looked inside the tent, they found a collection of 30 knives, along with a police scanner that basically picked up police radio chatter in the area. So you could listen to a scanner and basically know what the police were doing in your area. There were also all these weird piles of clothing. Some were for kids, some were for adults, some were for men, some were for women. There were piles of eyeglasses. And there were 8 pairs of women's underwear. And then also, there was a map of the Appalachian Trail inside of this tent. All over this map, along the trail, were all these spots that were circled. But there was no information about what these circles meant. However, one of the places that was circled was Dismal Creek. And then next to the map was a radio. And inside the radio was a cassette. And so the police just hit play. And immediately, what they heard totally creeped them out. Because the tape sounded like some kind of satanic ritual. It was basically this one man's voice just kind of howling and chanting over and over again. But by far, the most shocking thing that was found inside of that tent was a single piece of paper. And this piece of paper was a birth certificate. And the name on the birth certificate was a name that basically all police in this area knew. And in fact, anybody living in or around the Appalachian Trail would definitely know this name. The identity of this person, the name on the birth certificate, was the key to putting together all these seemingly disconnected events that had happened on this night. From the explosion when Ricky walked away from the fire, to the bloody man at the house, to the truck crash, they were all connected through this single person. A few hours earlier, after Ricky had gotten up and walked away from Sean and Scott's campsite, and then after barely making it onto the trail, he had turned around and there was that loud explosion. Well, at that point in the story, Ricky, who's now looking back at the campsite and looking at Sean and Scott, he can see that the two of them, they've heard the sound too. And they were now staring at each other with looks of absolute shock and terror on their faces. But then Ricky watched as Sean reached up and touched his face, and he put his hand out in front of his face, and it was covered in red. And the reason for that was because Sean had just been shot in the face, because that loud explosion was the sound of Ricky shooting his gun at Sean. And as Sean and Scott stood there staring at each other in absolute disbelief, Ricky, who's still in the tree line, ran towards the fire and just kept on shooting. And so Sean, at this point, as he sees Ricky coming into the campsite, he stands up and kind of staggers back and falls on the ground. But Scott, who's not hurt at this point, he just gets up and starts running away from the campsite. And Ricky turns his attention towards Scott. And he shoots at him, and he hits him straight in the neck and also in the back. But somehow, Scott just kept on running despite these horrible wounds. And so Ricky watched as Scott disappeared into the woods. And then Ricky turned back to Sean, who's laying on the ground and can't go anywhere. He's been shot in the face. And Ricky just casually raised his gun and shot Sean right in the chest. But amazingly, Sean, after getting shot this second time, it created what must have been the most extreme adrenaline rush ever, because he jumped up to his feet and right in front of his attacker, he just turned and sprinted to his Jeep. He hopped inside, fired it up, and just sped away as fast as he could. And when Sean flipped on his headlights and turned a corner after getting away from the campsite, he looked down the road and he actually saw his buddy Scott, who had run away first, come tumbling out of the woods onto the road. And so Sean, who's gravely injured, drives over next to Scott, and he stops the Jeep long enough for Scott to climb inside. And they shut the door and they sped away towards the nearest help, which happened to be that house where those two women lived. And so it was Scott, who looked like he was drenched in blood, who knocked on the women's door. Sean was down in the Jeep out on the road, but he was just too weak to get out and come up to the door as well. But when the ambulance and police arrived, they would find not only Scott up on the porch, but also Sean in the Jeep. And both men would be taken to the hospital via helicopter. And then, as for the man who was driving the truck down the road away from Dismal Creek, who then crashed right in front of the police, well, the driver of that truck was Ricky Williams. However, that was not his real name. There was no Ricky Williams. That was the name he just used. His real name, which was on the birth certificate that police found in that other campsite inside of the tent, was Randall Lee Smith. The same infamous Randall Lee Smith who had murdered those two hikers not far from Dismal Creek. That double homicide had happened in 1981, and Randall was caught and convicted. But he was paroled 15 years later in 1996 for good behavior. And for 10 years after that, Randall lived with his mother, and he wore this electronic bracelet. And, he followed the rules. But by 2008, his electronic bracelet had come off. And even though Randall had attempted to continue living with his mother, it just wasn't tenable. He didn't have enough money. And so ultimately, he packed up his things, grabbed his dog, and moved out onto the Appalachian Trail. And on the 6th of May, 2008, when Sean and Scott arrived in Dismal Creek to go fishing, Randall was waiting. Nobody has any idea why Randall murdered those two hikers back in 1981, or why he targeted Sean and Scott in 2008. All we know is that Randall Lee Smith was very mentally unwell. And very likely, he viewed the Appalachian Trail as like his sacred place. This was his home. This was the place he loved more than anything. And so maybe, he felt like Sean and Scott had somehow disrespected the Appalachian Trail, and that was enough to attack them. Now, we know Sean and Scott did not do anything intentionally disrespectful to Randall, because amazingly, Sean and Scott survived this attack. And they would say that when they saw Randall, they just felt bad for him. They thought he was like this alcoholic drifter who didn't have a home of his own. And so he was just living out in the woods on the Appalachian Trail. And so they didn't judge him. Instead, they really did just want to give him some food and spend some time with him and make him feel human again. That was it. And because Randall appeared to be this kind of small, older man, Sean and Scott, who were, very big and imposing, they didn't feel threatened by this guy. As for that bizarre other campsite that police found up around Dismal Creek, the one that contained all those knives and the birth certificate, well, obviously that was Randall's campsite. And that weird cassette tape that they listened to that sounded like a satanic ritual, that was Randall going through his meditations and chants that he would do when he was out in the middle of nowhere. It was like his way of respecting Mother Nature and the Appalachian Trail. And then all those items that were found inside of his tent, the different clothes and the eyeglasses and the women's underwear, it's believed those could be Randall's other victims. However, when police pulled DNA samples from all of those items that were found inside of his tent, like the clothes and the underwear and the eyeglasses, well, those DNA samples did not match any of the missing people or murder victims in the police's database. And so that wasn't useful. And then also, police went to all those places on that map that were circled, and with the exception of, obviously, Dismal Creek, they didn't find anything else at the other locations that suggested any violent event had happened there. So only Randall knows the truth, which means we will never know the truth. Because just 4 days after Randall was pulled out of that truck that he crashed, he died in police custody from a blood clot that formed as a result of the crash. And in those 4 days that Randall was in custody, he never gave up that there were any other victims. Today, Sean still has a bullet in his head and in his chest. And Scott still has big scarring on his neck and on his back. But both men have made a full recovery, relatively speaking. And they still go back to Dismal Creek all the time to go camping and fishing. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On a Saturday afternoon in February of 2011, an 18-year-old college student named Michael Perry found himself 1,000 feet underground inside one of America's most dangerous cave systems. He was crouched low inside a vast, dark cavern in Lafayette, Georgia, surrounded by 4 of his friends. As Michael shifted his weight, the beam from his headlamp danced across the cave walls, catching slick rock formations dripping with moisture. The light briefly illuminated underground waterfalls cascading through the darkness before vanishing into deep black crevices that seemed to have no bottom. The entire place felt alien, cold, and completely cut off from the sunny world above. And before that day was over, 2 people inside that cave would be dead. The cave they were exploring was called Ellison Cave. Michael and his friends had driven more than 400 miles from their college town in Gainesville, Florida, just to see it. Ellison was famous among experienced cavers. It was a sprawling underground maze filled with narrow tunnels, massive vertical drops, freezing waterfalls, and pitch-black chambers that could turn deadly in an instant if something went wrong. Every year, adventurers from all over the country traveled there looking for excitement. But, to be perfectly clear, this kind of activity, caving, it was not really Michael's thing. Not at all. He was a marketing major at the University of Florida. If you asked him to describe himself, he would have said he was a pretty quiet person. He enjoyed studying, he liked playing in his school's band, and he dedicated a lot of his time to volunteering with his church youth group. So the idea of crawling through a tiny, pitch-black, intensely claustrophobic hole hundreds of feet beneath the Earth's surface, that did not rank high on his list of fun things to do. In fact, it probably wasn't on the list at all. But Michael wasn't in Ellison Cave that day for fun. He was there for a very specific reason, and that reason was his close friend, a guy named Grant Lockenbach. Grant had been the one to suggest the trip. He was passionate about it, and when Grant got an idea in his head, he was very persuasive. So Michael, being a good friend, had simply said, "Okay, I'll go with you." Just then, Michael glanced over to where Grant was sitting. He was with his girlfriend, a young woman named Carrie, and their 2 other friends were there as well. The group of them were huddled together, looking through a large backpack. They were taking inventory, checking over the various pieces of specialized gear they had brought along with them for the expedition. They had only entered Ellison Cave a few minutes ago, but they had already stopped. The group had paused their progress because there was something in this specific area of the cave that Grant was absolutely determined to see. And when Grant wanted to do something, it almost always happened. That was just the kind of person he was. It's why Michael, despite his reservations, had capitulated and ended up deep inside this mountain. Grant wanted him to come, and so, like he normally did, Michael went along with it. Grant was a natural leader. He was the president of their school's Fellowship of Christian Athletes, a group that Michael, Carrie, and the other 2 friends were also devoted members of. When Michael had first joined the fellowship, Grant had immediately taken him under his wing. He saw something in Michael. He told him that he had tons of potential. In fact, Grant had said that Michael had enough potential to one day become the next president of the fellowship himself. Hearing this from Grant had been a huge deal for Michael. It gave him a massive boost of confidence because he really truly looked up to Grant. And he wasn't alone in that. A lot of people did. Grant was just one of those effortlessly cool guys. He was a few years older than Michael, stood about 6 feet tall, and was basically a walking, talking ball of positive energy. He was always on the lookout for the next adventure, the next challenge to conquer. Caving was one of those adventures. Grant had been exploring caves as a serious hobby for the past 3 years, and out of everyone in their group that day, he was the only one with any real practical caving experience. And it was precisely because of this lack of experience among the others, Michael included, that Grant had chosen an easier route for them. They were navigating a tunnel within Ellison that was basically a straight shot through the mountain. It was a beginner's trail. It didn't require much in the way of technical gear, like ropes or complex climbing equipment. But despite the low level of difficulty for their chosen path, they had brought all of that extra equipment anyway. They had ropes and harnesses and carabiners. They had it all. And that was because along this easier route, right at the spot where they were now stopped, was the entrance to a massive vertical shaft. And Grant specifically wanted to climb down into it, even if he had to go alone. This particular shaft was 125 feet deep. To put that in perspective, imagine a 10-story building. That's how far this pit dropped straight down into the earth. But in the world of serious caving, this was actually considered a small one. It was officially called the warm-up pit, because compared to the other, much deeper pits inside Ellison Cave, it was nothing. Some of the other vertical drops in the cave were way, way deeper, some over 500 feet. So while this was definitely not a beginner's task, for an experienced caver like Grant, it was a manageable, almost routine challenge. Michael watched as Grant picked up the backpack, the one with all the equipment inside, and carried it over to the entrance of the pit. The entrance was just a very large, dark hole in the cave floor. It was situated over near a noisy waterfall, and it was only a few feet away from where Michael was standing. So Michael walked over to Grant to offer his help. He wanted to assist him in setting up the gear for his descent. The process involved attaching a long climbing rope securely to the rocks around the pit's edge, creating an anchor that Grant could then use to lower himself safely into the darkness below. This whole setup process is called rigging. It took them a while to get it all done. Michael, again, had no experience with any of this, so he had to wait for Grant to instruct him on every single step. He would hold a rope here, check a knot there, all under Grant's careful direction. But as Michael worked alongside his friend, he found himself peering down into that pitch-black hole. As he looked down into what felt like a bottomless abyss, he felt his stomach do a little flip. He was suddenly very, very glad that he had not promised Grant he would go down into the pit with him. Because seeing it now, up close and in person, it was terrifying. He wanted no part of going down into that thing. But Grant clearly did. His eyes were bright with excitement. He was in his element. So Michael and Grant continued the process of getting Grant all set up. And then, eventually, when Grant was fully rigged and ready to go, Michael heard a strange sound. It was the sound of something heavy sliding off a rock. And then, just moments later, that sound was followed by a loud, echoing thud that seemed to come from deep, deep inside the hole, from the bottom of the warm-up pit. For a brief moment, Michael was just confused. He didn't know what he had just heard. Maybe it was just a loose rock that had tumbled into the pit. But then he looked over at Grant. Grant had a very unhappy expression on his face, and he was staring at the ground right next to the edge of the pit. He was looking at the spot where their backpack had been sitting just a second ago. The backpack with all of their extra equipment inside? At least, the equipment they weren't currently using. And the backpack was no longer there. It was gone. The backpack had just fallen 125 feet straight down into the pit. Now, obviously, this was not good. The last thing they wanted was for their backpack to be at the bottom of that hole. But it was actually much worse than just potentially losing some of their equipment. Because inside of that bag was the only cell phone they had brought with them into the cave. And it was also where they had stored all of their extra ropes and other essential climbing gear. They had taken some things out, of course, to get Grant rigged up for his descent, but losing that bag felt really, really bad. Without the contents of that backpack, they could easily get stranded or trapped deep inside of this cave, and they wouldn't be able to call or text anyone for help. They would be completely stuck. And so Michael could feel a wave of panic starting to wash over him. But then Grant cut in. He played it cool, as he always did. He just looked at the group and said, "Look, it's no big deal." He would just go down there and get it. I mean, he was already planning on going into the hole anyway, and he was all rigged up and ready to go after all. So he would simply go down, retrieve the bag, and come back up. It would be fine. And then, before Michael or Grant's girlfriend, Carrie, or any of the other friends could say a word, Grant just strapped on his harness and a pair of ascenders. Ascenders are climbing tools that would help him move down the rope in a controlled, measured way. He began positioning himself at the edge of the pit, preparing to go down. Michael just watched Grant in complete awe. Grant was so confident, so in control, that he was able to make everyone else around him feel calm too. And Michael felt his own panic starting to subside just from watching Grant's unshakable demeanor. This wasn't the first time Grant had projected such calm in the face of danger. During Grant's freshman year of college, he had casually climbed up the entire exterior of one of their school's tallest dormitories just to see if he could do it. And he did. He had also joined the school's ROTC program, which is a military reserve training program, and as part of that, he had learned how to jump out of airplanes. So he had skydived, another one of his thrill-seeking activities. This moment here in the cave seemed like yet another perfect example of why Grant was such an incredible and natural leader. And as Michael watched him, he found himself hoping that by the time he potentially took over as president of the fellowship, he could be just as fearless, just as composed as Grant. But for now, Michael just watched as Grant very calmly lowered himself into the hole. And then he disappeared into the abyss below. For the next few minutes, it was very quiet in the cavern. All Michael could hear was the constant rushing sound of the nearby waterfall. So he and Carrie and the others just talked quietly amongst themselves. They waited for Grant to call back up to let them know that he had made it to the bottom and had successfully grabbed the backpack. And finally, they did hear Grant's voice. He did call out from somewhere deep down in that hole. But Michael couldn't really understand what Grant was saying. The waterfall that was blasting away nearby was really loud, and it created a lot of noise. And on top of that, Grant's voice echoed strangely around the stone walls of the cave, which made it almost impossible to tell what he was trying to say. So at this point, Michael and Carrie and the others, they weren't worried yet. They just figured this was an acoustics problem, not a safety problem. So Michael just walked over to the edge of the pit, and he leaned over carefully, trying to look down. But it was no use. He couldn't see Grant. He was too far down, and it was far too dark. And so Michael called out, asking Grant to repeat himself, explaining that they couldn't understand what he was saying from up there. And Grant did yell back. He clearly replied to Michael's call. But Michael still couldn't really make out the words. However, this time, there was something really different about the way Grant sounded. Again, even though he didn't know what Grant was saying, one thing was suddenly definitely clear. Grant no longer sounded like the calm, cool, and collected, fearless leader that he normally was. He was talking really, really fast. He was repeating himself. He was saying something over and over again very, very quickly with a sense of extreme urgency. And even though, again, it wasn't clear what the words were, the tone was unmistakable. Grant was scared. There was a problem. Now, obviously, problems can and do arise when you're rappelling into a 125-foot hole deep underground inside a cave. That can happen. But for Michael and the others, when they finally processed that something was seriously wrong for Grant, it was truly shocking. I mean, Grant is the guy that gets other people out of problems. He was the calm guy. Nothing ever rattled him. And so to hear him basically panicking, it was deeply unsettling for those of them standing at the surface. And so Michael and the others, they're kind of hit with this sudden dual realization. One, it's very unsettling to hear Grant sounding this way. But worse, two, is the fact that they are not cavers. They can't go into this pit and save Grant if he needs saving. Not only because they completely lacked the experience, but also because all the caving gear, all the climbing equipment was in that backpack that had fallen into the pit. It was down there with Grant. So there was no way they could realistically help him if he was in any sort of trouble down there. And also, their one and only cell phone was down there in that backpack in the pit as well. And so, unless Grant could somehow figure out whatever problem he was having and get himself back up to the surface on his own, Michael and the others knew, without even having to say it out loud, that they were completely and utterly helpless. And so, as this grim realization is setting in for Michael and the other friends, Grant goes from trying to talk to them, even though, again, they can't tell what he's saying, he just sounds panicked, to straight up screaming. He is screaming for them. Something is horribly, horribly wrong. And so Michael and Carrie, they start yelling down to Grant, trying desperately to get him to clarify what's going on. But you have this powerful waterfall that's causing all this noise and splashing water everywhere. It's dark. And Grant clearly is so panicked that he's not even listening to them anymore. And so it's just chaos. It's madness. And so Michael and Carrie, they turn to the other two friends that are with them. And they tell them, look, we're going to stay right here at this hole and wait for Grant. You two need to leave the cave right now. Go get help. And so the other two friends, they rushed off to do just that, disappearing back into the darkness of the tunnel. While Michael and Carrie just sat there by the edge of the pit, listening to Grant getting more and more hysterical by the second, somewhere far down in that black hole, they still had no idea what was wrong. But clearly, there was a major emergency happening. And so, for a little while after their friends had gone off to find help, Michael and Carrie, even though they're not really having a conversation with Grant because he's just kind of rambling and yelling and screaming and they still can't understand him, they're just kind of shouting down into the hole. They're yelling things like, everything's going to be okay. We've sent for help. It's going to be okay. You're going to get out of here soon. They had no idea if he could even hear them or understand what they were saying. They were just assuming that the acoustics were just as bad for him down there as they were for them up here. Again, the sound of that waterfall was so incredibly loud. It was so dark. And so they're just having this awful, helpless moment. But then something cut through all of that chaos. At some point, Michael heard Grant say something that he really did understand. Grant, at some point, in a very high-pitched, almost screaming voice, yelled out Michael's name. It was like he was directly yelling to Michael a clear and desperate plea. I need you, Michael, to help me. Now, at this point, obviously, the situation has escalated dramatically. Things were already bad, but for Michael, this felt like a huge deal. I mean, before that, all the yelling and screaming was obviously terrible, but Michael, he kind of views himself as Grant's potential successor. He's going to be the next president of this fellowship. And he looked up to Grant so much, primarily because Grant was this fearless, capable leader. And so Michael sort of felt like when he heard his own name called out so clearly that Grant was specifically sort of challenging him. You, Michael, I need you. Michael took on that responsibility in that instant. And he felt like, I can't just sit here. I can't just wait for help to arrive. Something needs to be done right now, and I need to be the one to do it. I need to save Grant. And so Michael, he jumped up and he grabbed the extra harness they still had with them and he started to put it on. And as he was doing that, he could hear Carrie, who, she's seeing what's happening and she's telling him, don't do it. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to go down this thing. Like, this is dangerous. What are you doing? Don't go. And Michael, he just looked at her and he said, I have to do this. I know Grant would do this for me. I'm doing it for him. He needs me. I'm going down. And Michael, he's listening to Carrie, who is still trying to tell him not to go, but he just said to her, please pray for me. And then he walked over to the edge of the pit and he attached his harness to the very same rope that Grant presumably was still attached to somewhere down at the bottom, but stuck for some reason. And into the pit he went. As soon as Michael disappeared down into that hole, Carrie knelt down beside the pit. She put her hands together and she prayed as hard as she possibly could for both Michael and Grant to be okay. And after a few minutes, she heard Michael call out from somewhere in the hole. And for some reason, she could actually understand what Michael was saying. He called out that he and Grant were okay. He was with Grant, but they were just very, very cold. Relief flooded over Carrie. And as she exhaled all the tension she'd been holding in her body, and as the adrenaline kind of began to leave her system because now she's thinking everything is okay, she also realized that she too was very cold. She just hadn't been thinking about it before. She had been so fixated on the safety of her boyfriend and also of Michael. After all, she was only wearing a t-shirt and the cave was very damp and there's this waterfall constantly spraying a mist of cold water everywhere. It was a cold, damp environment. And so she's, her teeth are chattering too. She's cold. And so Carrie naturally yelled down into this hole. She can't see them, of course. She's just yelling into the darkness, what's going on? What's wrong? Is Grant okay? But Michael just shouted back to her, I'm fine. I'm fine. But he didn't answer her question about Grant. And at this, Carrie could tell that clearly there is something really wrong down there, and it probably has something to do with Grant. And so she stood up. She began pacing back and forth anxiously. Her stomach is in knots. And she's periodically yelling down into the hole to Michael, like, what's going on? Is Grant okay? Are you okay? But Michael, all he would say back to her is, I'm fine. I'm fine. He would just repeat that back to her. But his response time began to slow down. He wasn't responding to each and every one of her calls. He would just, occasionally yell out, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. But the responses just began to become more and more spaced out as Carrie began to ramp up her questioning, asking more and more, what's going on? Until finally, Michael just stopped answering altogether. There were no more voices coming out of the hole. And so, the minutes ticked by, and Carrie, she continued to pace around the edge of the pit, yelling out to Michael and Grant. But the only reply she got was the sound of the water from the waterfall lapping up against the cold cave walls. About an hour and a half later, just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a man named Anmar Mirza, along with 2 other men, ran into Ellison Cave, carrying a large bag filled with climbing equipment and medical supplies. Now, there was a bigger team of professional rescue workers on their way up the mountain behind them. That team had more gear and more personnel, but that group was moving much more slowly. It takes time to respond to a cave accident, because typically there are a lot of people and a lot of specialized equipment that is required. And also, usually, the victims are trapped in pretty remote and difficult to access places, like deep tunnels and narrow shafts deep inside of these caves. So Anmar and his 2-man team were the initial smaller group that went in ahead of the larger one, just to kind of get the rescue started as quickly as possible. A few minutes after entering the cave, Anmar saw a headlamp beam up ahead in the darkness, kind of bobbing around erratically. And as soon as he reached the origin of this light, he found a young woman. She was sitting by a large hole in the ground, and she was shaking and absolutely terrified. She explained that her name was Carrie, and that her boyfriend, whose name was Grant, along with one of his friends, whose name was Michael, were down in this hole. She told him that Grant had gone in first, there had been some kind of issue, and then Michael had gone in after him to help. And now, when she called out for them, neither one of them were responding. After hearing this, Anmar directed one of his team members to take Carrie and bring her safely out of the cave. And then, once they had left, Anmar put on his own climbing gear. And as soon as he was ready, he began to rappel down into the pit. As Anmar rappelled, he's looking straight down into this dark shaft. And at first, he can't see anything at all. But after a little while, he began to see, somewhere far down below, what appeared to be 2 small lights towards the bottom of the pit, which he correctly assumed belonged to the 2 missing men. But before he could actually reach them, he felt something wet and freezing cold splash against his cheek. Then he saw something emerge out of the darkness, right below him. It would turn out, when Grant had rappelled down into the warm-up pit, he had made a terrible, terrible mistake. He had attached his rigging, his main rope, to a section of rock that was directly in the path of a freezing cold waterfall. Now, this alone could have been okay. You can rappel effectively through a waterfall if you're careful and you move quickly. Except what happened with Grant is, as he was rappelling literally through the flowing water, like the water is coming off this waterfall and it's hitting him directly, he got stuck. His rope got tangled, and the spot where he got stuck was literally in the direct path of the waterfall. So, he's stuck in the cave. He can't go up. He can't go down. And he's just getting pounded by a constant stream of freezing cold water. Now, at first, what Grant likely did is kind of flail around trying desperately to get out of the path of this water, but there was nowhere to go. He's in this narrow vertical shaft. There's nowhere to move, and he's just dangling there. And he began trying to scream out for help. But that was why his words were so muffled. The water was hitting him in the face, making it impossible for him to speak clearly. And then also, as he's just dangling there very, very quickly, having that icy water hitting him nonstop would have sent his body into shock. It's like he wouldn't have been able to speak or even think anymore. He was rapidly becoming hypothermic. And then, in what was possibly one of his final moments of clarity, he managed to belt out Michael's name. He said it really clearly. He must have managed to get his face out of the direct path of the water for just a second. And Michael, who trusted Grant completely, when he heard his name being called, it felt like it was his personal calling. He felt he needed to go in there and save Grant himself. And so, into the hole he went. And he hooked his own rope up into the same exact spot that Grant had used. And down he went. And Michael, he did an incredibly brave thing by doing this. And it was something that Grant very likely would have done for him too. But again, Michael really had no idea what he was doing. He was basically just going in blind. However, unfortunately, because he just kind of followed Grant's lead and went down there without a plan, well, in the darkness, as he went down, he eventually reached the spot where Grant was, but he got stuck as well. Also, in the path of the waterfall. Granted, he was not nearly as exposed to the water as Grant was. Like his face was not getting blasted by water, so he was able to call out and be heard by Carrie at least for a little while. But he also got tangled at the same spot. He couldn't move. His body was getting hit by this icy water. And so even though the rescuers did eventually get down to Michael and Grant, by the time they did, it was too late. The two young men had frozen to death. They had basically dangled inside of that hole, getting hit by that freezing water for about 2 hours before their bodies just completely shut down. In 2013, 2 years after both Michael and Grant died inside of that cave, the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission gave Michael a posthumous medal for risking his own life in an attempt to save Grant's. On a Friday night in late March of 1980, an 83-year-old man named Harry R. Truman sat on his couch in his remote Washington State lodge. He had a glass of whiskey and Coke in his hand, and he turned on his battery-operated radio to listen to the news. Just a second or two later, he found himself having to jack up the volume on the radio because he couldn't hear it anymore. A couple of his cats were fighting in the other room, yowling and hissing, and it was causing a whole commotion. Harry had lost track of how many cats he actually had living with him, but it was a lot. Maybe a dozen or so. And even though at this particular moment he yelled and cursed at them and told them to knock it off, he was actually glad they were out there with him. He liked their company. 5 years earlier, Harry's beloved wife Edna had died. And ever since then, he had lived completely alone, minus all of these cats. And he also didn't have a lot of neighbors to speak of either. So, for the most part, he had been fairly isolated for the last few years. Also, Spirit Lake, the beautiful lake that his lodge was situated on, was a 4-hour drive south of the major city of Seattle. It was pretty far out there, deep in the wilderness. The lake did get busy during the summer months with tourists and campers, but at this time in March, there were only about 60 people that lived there year-round, and they were all very spread out. But Harry didn't really mind the solitude. He missed Edna a lot, of course, but he had his cats, and he had his radio, and he had the jaw-dropping mountain scenery and the lake right outside his door. And he had his whiskey and cokes. So overall, even though he was sort of a gruff, cantankerous guy, he was actually quite happy with his life. But just then, there was a loud knock on Harry's front door. And Harry was not surprised by this. I mean, yes, he lived way out in the middle of nowhere, and he did not normally expect visitors. But in this case, he knew exactly who it was. And as soon as he thought about that, his face contorted into a deep scowl. He was really annoyed. At this point in Harry's life, he really only had one problem. And it was a major problem, at least to him. And that was the government. For the last few days, government agents, like almost certainly the ones that were knocking on his door right now, had been harassing him. They were trying to get him to leave his lodge, to abandon the home in the wilderness that he loved so much. They said they needed to conduct some kind of federal operation, and they wanted everybody in the area to clear out. Now, Harry loved his country. He had even fought for it during the First World War. But he really did not like authority, and he could not tolerate being told what to do. During Prohibition, for example, which was a period of time in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal in America, Harry had simply ignored the law completely and made his own booze. He just didn't care about their rules. So, over these last few days, as these federal agents had come to his house trying to get him to leave, Harry had not been intimidated in the slightest. He had simply stood his ground. And he figured it was really only a matter of time before the federal government sent a local police officer over in the hopes that Harry would be more cooperative with somebody that he likely already knew. But what they didn't know about Harry is that Harry really didn't cooperate with anybody. Not with the government, and certainly not with local police. Not with his own family, not with his friends, and not with the 2 ex-wives he'd been with before he found Edna. He was just somebody who marched to the beat of his own drum. Always. So now, Harry did not get up to answer the knock at his door. Instead, he just waited until the person out there, the visitor, yelled through the door and announced who they were. And not really to Harry's surprise, it was the local deputy, a man that Harry did know. He was clearly being sent here by the federal agents to try one more time to get Harry to leave. And when Harry still didn't answer the door, even after the deputy had clearly announced himself knowing that Harry would recognize his voice, when Harry still didn't get up, didn't answer the door, the deputy finally, just sort of frustrated, called out, "Harry, are you sure you don't want to go?" Now, even though this deputy was being a whole lot more amicable than the government agents had been, they had been really forceful, basically telling him, "You've got to leave." The deputy here was at least kind of giving Harry a chance to make a decision for himself. Despite that, the question the deputy had asked just made Harry really mad. Because leaving his house was just not something he would ever consider doing. Harry had lived in this lodge for 54 years. And 37 of those years were spent running this lodge as an inn, as a business, with his late wife Edna, who was the love of his life. Now, he'd let the lodge go a little bit after she had died. So truthfully, it was kind of falling apart, and it smelled terrible because of all the cats. But it had been theirs, and now it was his, and he would never give it up. And not only that, but just outside his doorstep was Spirit Lake, which Harry believed was the most beautiful, perfect place in the entire world. It was quiet and serene and situated right at the base of some of the most breathtaking mountains he had ever seen in his whole life. And so to say Harry loved it here was a complete and total understatement. His lodge and Spirit Lake were basically his whole identity. Harry didn't know if he believed in God, but he did believe in the trees and the lake and the birds that screeched at him at all hours of the day. It was like his home, this whole area, was his religion. And he certainly was not about to give it up just because some federal authority or government agent or whoever else told him to. So, all Harry said to the deputy waiting outside his door was a very firm good night, which Harry was actually quite proud of himself for because he had a really hard time not swearing. So, this seemed pretty mild for him. After that, Harry waited to see if the deputy would challenge him or say anything else, but he didn't. And moments later, Harry heard the deputy's footsteps crunching down the gravel driveway and heading back towards his police cruiser. After that, Harry leaned back into his couch and smiled to himself. He picked up his drink, kind of toasting himself for standing his ground. And at the same time, he was sort of hoping that maybe now, finally, the officials would understand that he was not going to change his mind. But that's not what happened. A little more than a week later, on the morning of April 5th, Harry sat in a folding chair in a clearing by his house. He had his binoculars pressed to his eyes and a fresh glass of whiskey sitting in the cup holder of his chair. This was an area of the woods near his house that he called his cocktail lounge, where he'd often go to relax with a drink. It was covered by a thick canopy of evergreen trees, but it also had a great view of the mountains and the lake. But Harry was not here to relax. He was actually on very high alert, because the woods all around him were absolutely crawling with federal agents and local law enforcement officers. Harry could literally see them right now through his binoculars, walking around the various camps they had set up all over the mountainside and also down near the lake. And there was nobody to stop them, because everybody else who lived in this forest had bowed to the pressure and had left when they were told to. which meant that Harry was quite literally the last resident still fighting the good fight. Now, so far, the officials had not physically attempted to force him out of his home, but now that Harry saw them all assembling all over the mountainside, he had to wonder how long he had before they did try. But at the same time, he also knew that he had one piece of very important and very surprising leverage over the authorities. And that was that over the past couple of days, Harry's stubborn refusal to leave his wilderness home, just because the government told him to, had turned him into a media attraction. Reporters had heard about what was going on, and they had started coming all the way out to his house to talk to him. Now, usually, Harry just did not like the press. Even though he clearly listened to the news himself, he still thought of the press, thought of the media like they were vultures, always just looking for dead meat and chaos. But Harry also really, really liked to talk, and he had a lot of very strong opinions. And now, seeing his beautiful lake inundated by all these outsiders, Harry realized he had to take full advantage of this media interest in him if he wanted to have any chance of staying in his home. Because the way he saw it was, the government could not really make him do anything against his will if the whole world was watching. So, over the next month, Harry gave a lot of interviews. And pretty quickly, he became kind of an international celebrity. He was this single, older man standing up to something way bigger and way more powerful than himself, which was sort of admirable. Although people didn't really understand why he was doing it, it was still a big story. It was very interesting. But more than that, it seemed like the public just sort of liked Harry. In his interviews, Harry would swear and yell and rant and rave and tell reporters about how no authority figure would dare try to get him out of his house. He famously said, "No, I'm not going to leave. You're damn right I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay here. Damn right this is my home. They're going to have to come and get me. No authority could take me out of here. No authority dare." And he'd also talk about his life, just telling these crazy stories that had nothing to do with the wilderness, like about the whiskey that he bottled and distilled himself during his Prohibition days, which he called panthropy, and about his relationship with his late wife Edna and how they used to dance together right at the edge of the lake. Or his war stories from World War I. I mean, this guy was just really quite fascinating. And so, by the time May rolled around that year, Harry went from being bombarded by the government to being bombarded by the media. Today, this would be like going crazy viral, where everybody's seeing you on their feed. But this was 1980, and so people got their news from newspapers and the television and the radio. But those mediums were all full of Harry Truman, and people were kind of obsessed. Everybody from average citizens to school kids sent Harry fan mail. Reporters and news crews came to Harry's in droves, and some even took helicopters just to get there more quickly. And Harry, if he was being honest with himself, he sort of relished all the attention. A few months earlier, he'd been perfectly happy with his quiet life. He had no phone, and he just had his 1,000 cats for company. But now, it was like the whole world cared about him, and it was pretty cool. A few weeks later, though, everything changed. On Sunday, May 18th, the sun came up on Harry's lodge, and the woods around it were totally quiet for the first time in weeks. Because Harry, in some ways, had won. He had kept his word, and he'd stayed strong, and refused to give in to the government's demands to leave. And finally, the government had backed down. The sheriff had even come by the day before to tell Harry that, okay, no one's going to come by and ask you to leave anymore. It's on you. And so now, on May 18th, as Harry was getting up, it was just him, the lake, the trees, and the big, beautiful mountain. And then, at 8:32 in the morning, a deafening boom shook the earth. It would turn out the media was not totally finished with the story of Harry R. Truman. In fact, what happened on the morning of May 18th, 1980, would in many ways make Harry even more famous than he already was. Because Harry didn't live at the base of just any old mountain. His lodge was situated directly at the foot of Mount St. Helens, which was an active volcano, The government operation that the federal agents and local law enforcement were trying to run here was an evacuation. They were not trying to impede on Harry's rights as a citizen. They were trying to save his life. But Harry was so convinced that the land he loved so much, the land that he had lived on for nearly 60 years, would not hurt him. And so he ignored the authorities' repeated and urgent warnings. But Harry's decision was the wrong one. And on May 18th, he paid for his mistake. Because that morning, Mount St. Helens erupted, sending an avalanche of searing hot lava and mud directly onto Spirit Lake and Harry's lodge, killing him and all of his cats instantly. His remains were never found. 57 people died during this eruption, including Harry. Today, in that area, Harry has both a trail and a ridge that are named after him. So, in a way, he remains a part of the mountain that he loved so much. And in both of today's stories, the people at the center of them made choices they believed were the right ones. Grant believed he could handle the cave. Michael believed he could save his friend. Harry believed the mountain he loved would never harm him. But sometimes, confidence, loyalty, and even love can push people toward decisions they never fully realize are dangerous until it's far too late. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know which story stayed with you the most in the comments below. And if you want more true stories about strange disasters, impossible decisions, and people who found themselves in situations far beyond their control, we have an entire playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time, see ya. In the world of extreme sports, some individuals are driven by a quiet internal need to find where their limits lie and then push slightly past them. Throughout the 1990s, Andrew McCauley was exactly that kind of individual. He was an elite Australian mountaineer and rock climber known within the community for establishing dozens of difficult big wall climbing routes across Australia. When he traveled to famous climbing regions like New Zealand, Patagonia, and the Himalayas, he deliberately ignored the marquee peaks, the famous mountains that brought fame and media attention. Instead, McCauley sought out obscure, lesser-known peaks that offered superior complexity and technical challenge. To him, the reward was the purity of the struggle, not the applause at the summit. However, the trajectory of his life altered drastically in 1998. During a challenging climb, McCauley suffered a catastrophic 30-meter fall, shattering his knee. The injury was severe enough to ensure that he would never again climb at an elite, world-class level. For a man whose identity was entirely wrapped up in testing his physical boundaries, the diagnosis felt like a definitive ending. Yet, this massive setback ultimately birthed his life's true passion, sea kayaking. McCauley discovered that kayaking allowed him to bypass his physical limitations as the sport relied almost entirely on upper body strength and core stability rather than the heavy use of his legs. He adapted to the water with astonishing speed. Applying the same intense drive that fueled his mountaineering career, McCauley began conquering the most dangerous open-ocean kayaking routes around Australia and New Zealand. Before long, he had successfully completed almost every major open water challenge the region had to offer. Only one ultimate, unconquered frontier remained: the Tasman Sea. The Tasman Sea is a notoriously violent stretch of water separating Australia and New Zealand. Spanning approximately 1,000 miles, it is plagued by volatile weather patterns, brutal winds, and massive swells. McCauley calculated that the solo journey would take him at least 30 days, perhaps slightly longer depending on the conditions. From the outset, McCauley knew that his primary adversary would not be his own mental or physical exhaustion, but the ocean itself. Because a human being cannot accurately forecast or avoid bad weather over a 30-day window, a standard weather window did not exist for this journey. Surviving the Tasman was not a matter of if he would hit a storm, but how he and his vessel would endure the storms when they inevitably arrived. Other adventurers who had previously attempted to cross the Tasman Sea relied on highly specialized, custom-built kayaks. These vessels featured heavy integrated canopies and mechanical self-righting systems designed to automatically pop the kayak back upright if it flipped over. Macaulay, true to his purist mountaineering roots, rejected these elaborate designs. He did not want the bells and whistles of modern technology. He wanted a pure, direct relationship between himself, his paddle, and the sea. Nevertheless, he required some form of shelter to survive overnight storms and sleep safely. To solve this, Macaulay went into his own backyard and manufactured a crude, homemade fiberglass capsule that resembled a large trash can lid. This custom pod was designed to sit directly over his cockpit. When he needed to paddle, the capsule was stored on the back deck of his kayak. When a storm rolled in or when it was time to sleep, he could pull the structure over himself, creating a completely sealed, watertight capsule. If the kayak flipped in the middle of the night, the capsule would provide enough buoyancy to keep him from sinking and drowning. Seeking to bring a bit of levity to his austere vessel, Macaulay painted a large, bright smiley face on the fiberglass dome and named it Casper. On the 11th of January, 2007, after months of meticulous physical preparation and gear testing, the moment of departure finally arrived. On the shores of Australia, Andrew Macaulay kissed his wife Vicky and their young son goodbye. He climbed into his kayak, secured his gear alongside Casper, and paddled away from the coastline into the vast expanse of the open ocean. For the first two-thirds of the trans-Tasman journey, Macaulay's meticulous planning seemed to pay off perfectly. He established a disciplined routine, checking in regularly via his satellite radio to update his support team on his progress. His supplies of food and fresh water were holding up well, his physical conditioning was keeping exhaustion at bay, and his custom-built capsule, Casper, worked exactly as intended, allowing him to seal himself away at night to get crucial hours of sleep. However, as he entered the final third of the 1,000-mile journey, the predictable luck of the early weeks evaporated. The severe, chaotic weather systems that he had anticipated began rolling in back to back, offering him no time to recover between storms. The Tasman Sea was living up to its brutal reputation. During one particularly ferocious storm, the ocean transformed into a chaotic wall of moving water. Macaulay was forced to retreat entirely inside his cockpit, locking himself beneath Casper as 3 0-foot waves hammered his small craft. For 28 consecutive hours, he remained trapped in total darkness inside the cramped, suffocating fiberglass capsule. Outside, the immense waves wreaked absolute havoc, violently flipping his kayak over multiple times. Inside the vessel, Macaulay had access to an emergency GPS distress beacon. A single press of that button would have immediately transmitted his exact coordinates to international rescue crews, who would have deployed ships and aircraft to save his life. Yet, despite being violently thrashed around by mountain-sized waves in total isolation, Macaulay refused to press it. Much like his aversion to factory-modified kayaks, he possessed a fierce independence and did not want outside intervention to compromise the purity of his solo achievement. Instead of signaling for help, Macaulay chose to maintain a brave, stoic front for those watching from the shore. Once the worst of the 2 8-hour storm finally subsided and he was able to open the capsule, he used his satellite device to send a brief, characteristically sarcastic text message to a friend on land. Making light of a terrifying ordeal that would have broken most people, the text simply read, "No picnic today." With the storm behind him, Macaulay adjusted his gear, gripped his paddle, and continued to push eastward toward New Zealand, completely unaware of the final trials the ocean had in store for him. Next story, Zach Bowen and Addie Hall, the Katrina survivors. In the humid summer of 2005, the vibrant and chaotic streets of New Orleans brought together 2 bartenders named Zach Bowen and Addie Hall. To those who observed them from the outside, they seemed like an intriguing but highly volatile match. Addie was a woman with a fiercely protective and unpredictable personality. She often used a sharp, mean girl persona as a defense mechanism and a way of flirting, testing the men around her to see if they possessed the strength to handle her. It turned out that she had intense, sudden outbursts of anger that could flare up instantly and vanish just as quickly. Zach, meanwhile, was charming, but possessed a dark undercurrent and a volatile temper of his own. In many ways, they were mirrors of each other, sharing a chaotic energy that manifested in intense, frequent arguments. During the first few weeks of their relationship, their mutual friends openly doubted they would last more than a month, predicting that their explosive chemistry would inevitably burn the relationship to the ground. However, nature intervened before their own internal drama could tear them apart. Just weeks after they began dating, Hurricane Katrina gathered strength in the Gulf of Mexico and veered directly toward New Orleans, triggering mandatory evacuations and sending hundreds of thousands of residents fleeing for safety. Instead of joining the exodus, Zach and Addie made a fateful, impulsive decision to stay behind. They chose to bunker down together in the French Quarter and ride out one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. When the storm struck, submerging vast swaths of the city and knocking out power, clean water, and law enforcement, the sheer survival aspect of the crisis acted as a strange catalyst for the young couple. Amid the howling winds and rising waters, their volatile friction transformed into an intense, codependent bond. They fell deeply, madly in love, becoming entirely inseparable in a city that had suddenly been cut off from the rest of the world. As the floodwaters stabilized and the immediate danger passed, the French Quarter became an isolated island of survivalists, and Zach and Addie stepped into the void as unlikely leaders. Gathering whatever food they could find and pooling together an enormous supply of alcohol from their apartment, they constructed a makeshift open-air bar right on the street. While the rest of the city grappled with unprecedented tragedy, Zach and Addie spent their days cooking large meals for their struggling neighbors and handing out free drinks to anyone walking by. They brought a sense of defiant joy and colorful resilience to a community that had lost everything. This striking tale of romance blooming in the ruins of a disaster quickly caught the attention of national media outlets. Journalists looking for stories of human resilience flocked to them, and the New York Times even featured the couple in a prominent article about the post-Katrina spirit. For a fleeting, surreal moment in time, Zach and Addie felt like the undisputed king and queen of the French Quarter, living a bohemian dream built on the backdrop of a catastrophe. But disasters eventually end, and reality has a way of dismantling illusions. As the months pressed on, the long and painful process of rebuilding New Orleans began. Electricity was systematically restored to the neighborhoods, businesses reopened, citizens moved back into their homes, and the standard demands of daily employment returned. The lawless romantic frontier that had allowed Zach and Addie's relationship to thrive evaporated, forcing them back into a conventional lifestyle that neither of them was truly equipped to handle. For the next year, the couple struggled heavily under the weight of mounting financial pressure. As the bills piled up and the daily grind set in, the old, vicious arguments returned with a vengeance. Without a literal hurricane to fight against, they turned their destructive energies entirely on each other, engaging in constant, toxic, screaming matches that alienated their friends and left their relationship fractured beyond repair. By October 2006, realizing that their relationship was rapidly disintegrating, they decided that a drastic change of scenery was their only hope for a fresh start. Desperate to escape the bad memories of their old apartment, they found a small, historic flat located directly above the famed Voodoo Temple on Rampart Street. They made a quick cash offer and moved in immediately, hoping the unique space would reinvigorate their dying romance. Instead, the move only accelerated their descent. Shortly after unpacking, Addie made a devastating discovery. Zach had been cheating on her. Furious and entirely done with his betrayal, Addie went directly to the landlord and demanded that Zach's name be legally removed from the lease, preparing to evict him from her life for good. When Zach found out that he was being pushed out of the apartment before Addie even had the chance to officially confront him, it triggered an incredibly dark, wicked fight between the two, a confrontation far more sinister than any they had experienced before. A few days later, a strange quiet fell over the apartment. Zach showed up for his bartending shift at a local venue, but his coworkers immediately noticed that his demeanor had completely changed. He pulled a hat down low over his eyes, wore dark sunglasses indoors, and remained completely silent, refusing to engage with anyone. When worried friends asked him what was wrong, he simply muttered that he was fine and quickly walked away. Around the same time, Addie uncharacteristically failed to show up for her shifts at work. When people questioned Zach about her whereabouts, he casually lied, claiming that they had gotten into a massive blowout fight and that Addie had packed her bags and left New Orleans to return to her hometown in North Carolina. Given Addie's highly unpredictable nature and volatile history, many people accepted the explanation, assuming she had simply walked away from the toxic relationship. The horrifying truth came to light on the 17th of October, 2006. The police received an emergency call from an Omni Hotel staff member who had spotted a motionless body lying on the rooftop of their multi-story parking garage. When authorities arrived at the scene, they found Zach Bowen deceased from a high-impact fall. It was clear he had jumped from the roof, but the true horror began when investigators searched his pockets for identification. In his back pocket, police discovered a lengthy, meticulously written suicide note addressed directly to them. The note explicitly stated that his death was no accident, and that he had taken his own life because he had taken the life of another. He directed the police to the Rampart Street apartment, stating they would find the body of his girlfriend, Addie Hall. When police officers rushed to the address over the Voodoo Temple, they were completely unprepared for the gruesome scene awaiting them. Upon crossing the threshold, the officers were immediately struck by a severe, unnatural drop in temperature. Zach had intentionally cranked the apartment's air conditioning units to the lowest possible setting to preserve the scene. Looking around the dimly lit rooms, they saw chaotic, unsettling messages spray-painted in black ink all over the walls. Among lines declaring his own total failure as a human being, Zach had spray-painted stark arrows pointing directly toward the kitchen, accompanied by the chilling instruction to look in the oven. Following the grim signs into the kitchen, the officers opened the oven door and discovered the dismembered, cooked remains of Addie Hall, with additional body parts placed in pots on top of the stove. Hidden inside Addie's personal journal, police found a gruesome 8-page confession written by Zach. He detailed how, in a fit of rage, he had strangled Addie to death before using his bartending tools to dismember her, attempting to cook her remains to make them easier to dispose of. However, overcome by horror at his own actions, he found himself unable to finish the job, leaving a final apology spray-painted on the kitchen wall before walking to the hotel to end his own life. Today, in a bizarre twist of dark tourism and urban reality, that very same apartment on Rampart Street is still rented out to tenants, complete with the exact same stove where the tragedy occurred. Next story, Hisashi Ouchi, the human guinea pig. In the late autumn of 1999, a quiet technician named Hisashi Ouchi was living a perfectly ordinary life in Japan. He was a married man, a devoted father to a young son, an avid rugby enthusiast from his high school days, and a regular smoker who went about his daily routine without any inkling that his name would soon become synonymous with one of the most horrific medical and industrial tragedies in human history. Ouchi was employed at the JCO nuclear fuel processing plant located in the village of Tokaimura, a hub for Japan's nuclear industry. His specific task at the time was to help prepare a highly specialized liquid nuclear fuel intended for a fast breeder experimental reactor named Joyo. However, behind the clean, sterile exterior of the facility lay a corporate culture deeply corrupted by a desire to cut corners. Since 1993, the plant's parent company, JCO, had systematically abandoned strict government safety regulations to prioritize corporate profitability and speed. To facilitate this dangerous acceleration, management implemented an illegal, highly unregulated in-house operating manual known among the staff as the Shadow Guide. This Shadow Guide actively encouraged workers to bypass mandatory automated safety systems and perform highly volatile chemical mixtures by hand. The fatal consequence of this corporate negligence manifested on the morning of the 30th of September 1999. Hisashi Aochi and two of his colleagues were working in the purification room, rushing to complete a batch of Joyo fuel. Following the hazardous protocols outlined in the Shadow Guide, Aochi stood directly over a massive steel precipitation tank, physically holding a plastic funnel in place. A coworker stood on a platform above him, manually pouring a highly concentrated liquid uranyl nitrate solution from a bucket through the funnel and into the tank. The precipitation tank, however, was fundamentally never engineered or shaped to hold that massive volume of enriched uranium at one time. As the coworker poured the seventh bucket into the vessel, the concentration of uranium reached a critical mass. The geometry of the tank allowed the atoms to undergo a spontaneous, runaway nuclear chain reaction. A colleague sitting several meters away at a desk later described hearing an incredibly loud metallic bang, which was instantly accompanied by a brilliant, blinding flash of eerie blue light that filled the entire room. This blue flash was Cherenkov radiation, the visual manifestation of an immense lethal wave of ionizing radiation ripping through the atmosphere. Because Aochi was leaning directly over the tank, his entire body absorbed the absolute brunt of the energetic burst. Immediately following the flash, the room's radiation alarms blared, and Aochi was struck by instantaneous violent bouts of vomiting, lightheadedness, and severe dizziness. He was evacuated from the building and quickly airlifted to the University of Tokyo Hospital. Upon his arrival, medical professionals were initially astonished and deeply misled by his physical appearance. Aside from some mild redness and swelling on his right arm, the arm closest to the funnel, Aochi bore absolutely no visible physical trauma. He had no thermal burns, no bleeding lacerations, and no broken bones. He was completely conscious, lucid, in remarkably good spirits, and even joked with the nursing staff about how eager he was to get back home to his family. But the diagnostic data painted a catastrophic reality. Dosimetry reports revealed that Aochi had been bombarded with a staggering 17 sieverts of radiation. To put this into perspective, a dose of 8 sieverts is universally considered fatal to humans. Aochi had received the highest documented dose of radiation any human being had ever survived in recorded history. Medical specialists soon realized that Aochi was trapped in what radiologists call the walking ghost phase of acute radiation syndrome. Although he looked and spoke like a healthy living person, he was, from a cellular perspective, already a corpse. The massive influx of ionizing radiation had acted like a microscopic machine gun, completely obliterating the chromosomes inside his DNA. His body had completely lost the essential genetic blueprint required to replicate cells. Human life relies on constant cellular regeneration. As old cells naturally die off, the body replaces them to maintain tissue integrity. In Aochi's case, his body could no longer create a single new cell. His existing cells were dying off rapidly, and there was absolutely no biological mechanism left to replace them. He was completely conscious and alive to watch his own body systematically dissolve from the inside out. Initially, Aochi himself did not understand the absolute gravity of his condition. Having never experienced radiation sickness, he assumed that since he had survived the first few days, the worst was behind him. He expressed a naive belief that the maximum consequence of the accident might be the development of leukemia later in life, and his primary annoyance was merely having to stay in a hospital bed away from his son. However, by the third week, the horrific reality of chromosome destruction took hold. His internal organs began to fail as the lining of his gastrointestinal tract sloughed off completely, causing his intestines to hemorrhage uncontrollably. Simultaneously, his skin began to liquefy and peel away from his flesh in massive sheets. Without cellular replication, his body could not heal the raw tissue underneath. To prevent his vital bodily fluids and blood from continuously leaking out, doctors attempted numerous advanced skin grafts, but because his underlying tissue lacked the genetic capability to bond with the new skin, every single graft failed and rotted away. Medical staff resorted to wrapping his entire body in thick layers of medical gauze, leaving him looking like a living mummy. By late November, roughly 2 months into the ordeal, the pain escalated to an agonizing, unimaginable threshold that the human mind could not tolerate while conscious. Doctors placed Ouchie into a medically induced coma and attached him to continuous life support machine. While he was comatose, his heart stopped beating entirely due to the extreme stress on his cardiovascular system. Rather than letting him pass away peacefully, the medical team resuscitated him, restarting his heart 3 separate times over the course of his stay. During brief, agonizing windows where his sedation was lowered and he regained a modicum of consciousness, Ouchie used his remaining strength to scream at the doctors, pleading with them to stop the treatments, famously declaring, "I am not a guinea pig." The medical team, however, was caught in a profound ethical dilemma. They justified their relentless intervention by arguing that keeping him alive allowed them to test cutting-edge treatments such as experimental stem cell transplants that could potentially save future radiation victims. Yet, this pursuit meant that Ouchie was subjected to a prolonged artificial existence of pure torture. Finally, after recognizing the futility of their efforts and honoring the immense grief of his family, a formal do not resuscitate order was implemented. On the 21st of December 1999, after enduring 83 days of unparalleled physiological agony, Hisashi Ouchie's heart stopped for the final time, and he was finally permitted to die. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya!